I was standing less than 2 steps away from Chloe when she started searching through her bag for the third time. Both hands moved quickly through every small pocket, pulling out her sketchbook, earbuds, and charging cable, and dropping them onto the chair beside her. "Mom, it's not here." Chloe's voice was quieter than usual. I stepped toward her immediately. The purple medication pouch I had checked myself before we left home that morning was still gone. It was a little after 9 in the morning, and we were in the prep area behind my father's charity office in Columbus. Staff members were still moving through the hallway outside, and I could hear the printer running and phones ringing through the open door. I was still bent down checking beneath the chair when Chloe said everything in the room sounded too far away. I looked up. She was standing completely still, one hand gripping the edge of the table. She blinked several times as if she were trying to pull herself back, but when I asked if she could hear me, it took her a few seconds to turn her head. I had just enough time to get my arms around her before her knees gave way. Chloe's full weight fell against me. I lowered her to the floor, kept her head away from the leg of the table, and looked at the clock while trying to stop my hands from shaking. A staff member nearby hurried toward us. Someone else froze in the doorway. I called Chloe's name, but her eyes moved past me and stopped somewhere over my shoulder, as though she could hear my voice, but couldn't answer me yet. Elise was standing a few yards away. My sister didn't rush over. She didn't ask where the medication was. She didn't ask whether Chloe needed emergency help. She simply looked at her 13-year-old niece, going limp in my arms, and said, "She's milking it for attention." I looked up at Elise, and in that moment, the fear inside me turned into something else. Because I had checked that medication myself before we left home, and for nearly 40 minutes we had been searching for a pouch that should never have disappeared. And Elise was the only person who had kept insisting that neither my daughter nor I should show up at Grandpa's will meeting that afternoon. Before I tell you how we ended up on that floor, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what I learned about that missing medication changed the way I saw my sister, my father's foundation, and even some of my own choices as a mother. And if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. That morning had started with something so ordinary, I almost hated myself later for remembering it so clearly. I was standing at our kitchen counter around 7:45, drinking coffee that had already gone cold, while Chloe searched for the other shoe she swore she had left beside the front door. October had brought the first real chill to Columbus, and the windows over the sink were pale with condensation. My father had been dead for 1 week. His funeral had been only a few days earlier, and our house still contained the flowers people had sent, most of them beginning to brown along the edges. Chloe had barely slept. Neither had I. Still, her medication schedule remained one of the few things in our lives that did not bend for grief. Before we left, I checked the purple zip pouch myself. I saw the pharmacy label. I saw the morning dose inside. The zipper snagged on a loose thread near the corner, and I had to pull it free with my thumbnail before closing it. I slipped the pouch into Chloe's canvas tote beside her sketchbook. Her rescue medication stayed separately in my own bag, where I always kept it according to her action plan. Those details felt meaningless at the time. Later, they became the pieces I kept returning to whenever I wondered whether I had somehow made a mistake. We were not going to the foundation, because Chloe wanted to spend her morning surrounded by adults talking about Grandpa. Elise had asked us to stop by before the estate meeting to collect a box Walter had left in his office and to sit for a few photographs that she called family continuity. That phrase sounded exactly like Elise. She could turn grief into something that belonged on a donor memo. My father had started the Walter Callahan Children's Seizure Foundation 7 years earlier when Chloe was 6. At first, it had been small enough that I could name nearly everyone involved. Grandpa had watched me struggle through insurance appeals, pharmacy calls, missed work, and the quiet terror of learning what it meant to raise a child whose brain could suddenly stop cooperating with the rest of her body. He wanted to help families who did not have the resources we did. The first fundraiser had paid for medication assistance and transportation for a handful of children. Then the next one raised more. Elise discovered she was extraordinarily good at finding donors, speaking to reporters, and making strangers believe they were joining something larger than themselves. Somewhere along the way, Chloe became part of that message. At 6, she liked wearing the foundation t-shirt. At 8, she still enjoyed drawing thank you cards for donors. By 10, photographs of her were appearing in brochures and fundraising emails. I had agreed to those things because I believed in what the foundation was doing. Families really were getting help. Children really were getting medication. For a long time, every time Chloe looked uncomfortable about another photograph or another story about one of her seizures, I told myself that a little discomfort was worth it if another family could breathe easier. I had not yet understood what Chloe was learning from me each time I said that. The foundation office was only about 20 minutes from our house. When we arrived, the lobby was already busy. Staff members were preparing packets for the afternoon's special board session, and boxes of printed materials were stacked near reception. Near one wall stood an older campaign panel showing a younger Chloe beneath the words, "No child should miss a dose." I barely looked at it. By then, her face had been part of that building for so long that I had learned to walk past it. Chloe stayed close to me, not because she was frightened, but because she was tired. She had one of Grandpa's old mechanical pencils tucked behind her ear and kept rubbing the worn silver clip with her thumb. A staff coordinator named Marcy took us to the prep room beside reception so we could leave our coats and Chloe's tote before going upstairs to Walter's office. The room was not open to the public. Marcy tapped her badge against the reader beside the door, waited for the green light, and let us in. I noticed the small camera above the hallway, because cameras were something I noticed without thinking. I was a photographer. Light, angles, lenses, blind spots. They registered automatically. Chloe set her tote on a chair near a stack of folded event banners. We were out of that room for no more than 6 or 7 minutes. Elise caught us in the lobby before we reached the elevator. She wanted to know if we could spare a few minutes for photographs first. I told her Chloe had not eaten much breakfast and needed to take her medication before we did anything else. Elise was already looking over my shoulder toward one of her staff members. She said we had time, then disappeared into a conversation about a donor packet. There was nothing in that exchange that frightened me then. That is one of the things people misunderstand about betrayal. They imagine there must be a moment when the villain looks different, a shift in the eyes, a warning in the voice, something obvious enough that a sensible person should recognize it. Most of the time, there isn't. Most of the time, the person who is about to hurt you still looks exactly like the person you have known for 40 years. By the time Chloe and I returned to the prep room, her usual morning dose time had arrived. She opened the tote, and the purple pouch was not there. Marcy checked beneath the chair and around the counter while I retraced our steps. I emptied the tote once. Chloe emptied it again, and the minutes kept passing. Elise returned during the search and asked whether we were still looking for Chloe's purple medication pouch. I had told her Chloe needed her medication. I had never told her the pouch was purple. I remember noticing that for half a second, before fear pushed the thought aside. For nearly 40 minutes we kept looking while the dose grew later. By a little after 9, Chloe was searching the tote for the 3rd time, and the morning caught up to the scene I told you about at the beginning. Less than a minute after she said the room sounded too far away, her knees gave way and I was on the floor with her in my arms. Once she began responding normally again, I followed the seizure action plan we had practiced for years. I kept track of the time, watched her breathing and awareness, and called the neurology line. I did not shove anything into her mouth or try to force her upright. The episode had been brief, but it was still a breakthrough event, and the medication she was supposed to have taken was missing. The nurse on call told me to have Chloe evaluated and to bring whatever prescription information I had. I already knew that was what I was going to do. What I did not know was whether someone had moved the pouch accidentally or whether something much worse had happened. Marcy searched the prep room once more, while another staff member checked the lobby. Nobody found it. I asked who could get into that room. Marcy explained that staff access was controlled by badges. She seemed embarrassed even saying it, as though she understood what that detail suggested before I was willing to let myself think it. Elise stayed near the doorway. She had moved on from calling Chloe dramatic to telling me that I was making the right decision by taking her home. Home, not the hospital, not a doctor. Home. And then, almost as an afterthought, she reminded me that the estate meeting that afternoon was mostly paperwork anyway. I did not answer. Chloe was exhausted and leaning against me, and my attention belonged to her. The emergency department turned the next several hours into the strange flat rhythm hospitals always have. Registration, wristband, blood pressure, questions we had answered before, more waiting. Chloe returned fully to her usual awareness, but the fatigue stayed. She lay beneath a thin blanket with her eyes closed, while the staff verified her prescription and coordinated a replacement dose through the pharmacy and prescriber information. Nobody told me that one delayed dose had definitely caused what happened. Chloe had slept badly. She was grieving. Stress could lower the margin she usually depended on. What mattered was that something had changed. She had experienced a breakthrough event, and the medication we had brought with us had disappeared. I watched her sleep and thought about the loose thread on that purple pouch. I could still feel it beneath my thumbnail. That memory kept me from accepting the easiest explanation, the one where I had forgotten the medication at home or packed the wrong bag. I knew what I had seen. When Chloe woke properly, she looked embarrassed before she looked scared. That hurt more than I expected. She asked whether people at the foundation had seen what happened. At 13, she was old enough to understand that the same people who praised her for being brave often became uncomfortable when epilepsy stopped being a fundraising story and became something happening in front of them. I told her none of that mattered. Then I told her we were skipping the afternoon meeting. She did not argue immediately. That alone told me how tired she was. I had already decided that no estate document, no board agenda, and no family expectation was worth pushing her beyond what she could handle. By the time the hospital discharged her, she was back to baseline, but tired enough that I intended to take her home, close the curtains, and let the rest of the Callahans manage without us. We had barely reached the parking garage when Elise called. She did not ask how Chloe was feeling. Her first concern was whether we were still coming that afternoon. She told me there was no reason to drag Chloe through a meeting she did not need to attend. Henry could send me anything important later. Mom was already overwhelmed. The board session afterward would be tedious and probably run long. Elise dressed every argument and concern, but after the third reason we should stay away, I stopped hearing concern. I heard urgency. The estate briefing itself could not take anything away from Chloe because she was absent. Henry had already made that clear. Yet Elise seemed almost invested in the idea of both of us staying home. I told her I would decide what was best for my daughter. Then I ended the call. Chloe had been listening from the passenger seat. She was still wearing the hospital wristband. For a moment she said nothing, then reached for her phone. I reminded her that Grandpa's will would still exist tomorrow. Whatever he had decided about his estate would not change because she missed a meeting. Chloe shook her head. That was when I realized she was not thinking about the will at all. She opened an email Grandpa had forwarded to her 4 days before he died. The subject line was boring enough that I would probably have ignored it if she had not placed the phone directly in my hand. It was the final agenda for the estate briefing, and the foundation sessions scheduled immediately afterward. The estate items came first. Then came foundation business. Near the bottom was a line that made me sit straighter in the driver's seat. Youth story consent review. Chloe Callahan present. Chloe explained that Grandpa had promised her she could speak to the board herself. For months she had been telling him she did not want to keep appearing in new campaigns. She was tired of old hospital photographs being reused. She was tired of adults introducing her through the worst moments of her childhood. Elise had been telling people Chloe still supported the new campaign, and Grandpa wanted the board to hear the truth from Chloe instead of hearing another adult speak for her. My daughter looked down at the hospital band around her wrist while she explained it. She did not sound angry. If anything, she sounded guilty. The foundation helped children. She knew that. She did not want the programs to stop. She simply did not want helping those children to require giving Elise permanent ownership of her face and her illness. For years, I had answered that kind of discomfort by reminding Chloe how much good the foundation did. Sitting beside her in that parking garage, I finally heard how unfair the question had always been. Why should a 13-year-old have to choose between protecting herself and helping sick children? I told her the formal decision about any new release was mine to make as her mother and guardian, and I would make it in writing. She did not have to prove anything by walking into that room. But if she felt well enough later, and still wanted the board to hear her own voice, I would not take that choice away either. For the first time that day, some of the tension left her face. She leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes while I kept reading. Grandpa had copied Henry Sloan, several directors, Denise Harper, the outside lawyer handling foundation governance. Then I reached the final name on the email chain, Elise Callahan. I stared at it long enough that Chloe opened her eyes again. Until that moment, I had been forcing myself not to connect the missing medication to my sister. I had no proof. A missing pouch was not proof. A cruel comment was not proof. Elise being eager for us to stay home was not proof. But the email changed one thing. Elise had known about Chloe's place on that agenda before Grandpa died. She knew Chloe intended to tell the board that the story Elise kept using no longer had Chloe's permission behind it. And she knew exactly who Chloe was supposed to say it in front of. Elise's name stayed on the screen in my hand long after I had finished reading the email. She had known Chloe was supposed to speak to the board. She had known Grandpa had put the consent issue on the agenda himself. But sitting in that hospital parking garage, with my daughter still pale beside me and a plastic wristband around her arm, I also knew I had to be careful about what I let myself believe. Knowing about the meeting did not prove Elise had taken the medication. Wanting us absent did not prove it either. I had spent most of my adult life trusting things I could photograph, print, sign, or hold in my hands. Suspicion was not evidence. So, before I accused my sister of something I could barely stand to imagine, I needed to understand how we had reached a point where Chloe saying no had become important enough for anyone to fear. The beginning had looked nothing like this. In 2019, Chloe was 6, Grandpa was 65, and the foundation did not yet exist as a polished office with staff badges, donor packets, and annual reports. It began in the back room of a neighborhood community center, with folding tables borrowed from a church and handmade signs taped crookedly to the walls. Walter had met a family at Chloe's neurology clinic, whose son was missing appointments because his mother's car had broken down, and the specialist was nearly an hour away. They were also struggling with medication costs that kept shifting every time insurance changed something. Grandpa came home angry in the particular way he became angry when a problem seemed unnecessary. Within days, he was calling friends from the printing business he had sold years earlier, asking if they would help cover transportation and medication assistance for a few local families. I took the photographs for that first fundraiser because it seemed easier than hiring someone. Chloe sat at our dining room table the night before with a box of markers and made her own sign. She wrote in uneven purple letters, "I'm more than my seizures," then decorated the edges with stars that looked more like crooked flowers. She was proud of it. At 6, epilepsy was something she understood mostly through routines. Pills in the morning, pills at night, adults checking the clock. Occasional days when everything stopped and the world became frightening for reasons she could not control. She did not yet understand that people might someday look at her and see the diagnosis before they saw her. The fundraiser raised enough to help several families. I remember one mother standing beside Grandpa after the final count, holding an envelope that would cover gas cards, clinic transportation, and part of the cost of her son's medication. Her shoulders dropped when Walter explained what the money was for. It was the first time I saw what the project could become. Not a monument to Chloe, not a family brand. Just one frightened family making another frightened family's week a little easier. That was why I said yes. When Walter asked whether we could use the photograph of Chloe holding her sign in the first campaign, he did not assume. He put a release form in front of me at our kitchen table and gave me time to read it. I remember the line because I would see it again years later. The permission was for one campaign year. It was not written as forever. It was not a blank surrender of every future photograph or story about my child. I signed as Chloe's mother. Grandpa also asked Chloe, in the simple way you ask a 6-year-old, something that adults still have responsibility for deciding, whether she liked the picture and wanted people to see it. Chloe grinned and asked if her stars could stay. The form was scanned with the other foundation records. The photograph went onto a small brochure. Then it appeared on a donation page. Within months, people Walter knew from business began asking whether they could contribute more regularly. Elise was the one who saw how to turn those scattered donations into something sustainable. My sister was good at it. I can say that now, without softening anything that came later. Elise knew how to walk into a room of people with money and make them understand a problem without making them feel cornered by it. She remembered donors' children, the companies they ran, the causes they cared about. She learned the language of grants, nonprofit budgets, sponsorship agreements, and annual reporting with the same determination she had once brought to every job she took. Walter had the heart of the project. Elise gave it structure. The change was gradual. First, there was a part-time coordinator, then a proper nonprofit filing, a board, a small office, and partnerships with clinics and social workers who knew which families were most likely to fall through the cracks. Transportation assistance expanded. Emergency medication support expanded. By the time Chloe was 9, the foundation was helping far more families than Grandpa could have reached by writing checks himself. And Chloe's photograph kept working. Donors remembered her purple sign. They remembered the small girl with missing front teeth who said she was more than her seizures. New photographs followed as she grew. Sometimes I took them. Sometimes the foundation hired someone else. A few appeared in annual reports, others in email campaigns or on displays at community events. The photographs changed, but the story underneath them barely did. Chloe was always brave. Chloe was always inspiring. Chloe was always the child who had endured something difficult and was now helping other children endure it too. For several years, I thought that was beautiful. I saw the checks going to families. I photographed a mother crying when a transportation grant meant she no longer had to choose between missing work and getting her daughter to a specialist. I watched Walter carry boxes into clinics himself because he refused to ask volunteers to do work he would not do. I saw Elise convince a local company to fund an entire quarter of assistance when the program was running short. Nothing about those moments was fake. That was what made it so easy to ignore the smaller moments that began happening around Chloe. The first one I remember clearly took place in a grocery store when she was 11. We were standing in the cereal aisle, arguing about whether something containing marshmallows could reasonably be called breakfast, when a woman recognized her. The woman was kind. That almost made it worse. She thanked Chloe for being brave, told her she had seen one of the foundation videos, then asked whether Chloe still had the kind of seizures described in an older campaign story. Chloe stopped reaching for the cereal. I answered for her, redirected the conversation, and the woman moved on without meaning any harm. Chloe waited until we were alone again before asking, "Do they all know what happens to me?" I should have heard the real question underneath that one. Instead, I told her that people knew only what the foundation shared, and that her story had helped families who might otherwise feel alone. I thought I was reassuring her. What I actually did was explain why her discomfort was useful. She became more careful after that. She stopped wearing foundation shirts to school. If Elise asked for a photograph, Chloe wanted to know where it would appear. She began checking social media after events, not because she enjoyed seeing herself there, but because she wanted to know what had been posted. When people called her inspiring, she smiled, because she had learned that was the response adults expected. The stranger part was that she still cared about the foundation. She asked Grandpa whether a family we had met at a clinic had received transportation help. She drew cards for children spending long weeks in the hospital. When a donation drive collected supplies, she sorted them without being asked. She did not want the work to disappear. She only wanted herself to disappear from the advertising. By the time Chloe turned 12, even Grandpa had started noticing the difference between those two things. He pushed for a policy change concerning youth ambassadors. For new campaigns or renewals involving children 12 and older, the foundation would not rely only on a parent's written authorization. The child also had to agree. It was an internal policy, not some magical transfer of adult legal authority to a 12-year-old. I was still Chloe's parent. I still signed what required a parent's signature. But Walter wanted the organization to stop behaving as though a child who had once smiled for a photograph would automatically keep smiling forever. On paper, it sounded obvious. In practice, old habits had already taken root. The foundation had become larger. Campaign calendars were planned months ahead. Old photographs sat in digital archives. Staff changed. Donor presentations reused stories that had performed well before. Chloe's face had become familiar enough that people inside the organization stopped treating each new use as a fresh request and started treating her as part of the foundation itself. Elise's language changed too, although I did not notice it at first. She used to say Chloe's story. Later, she began calling it our story. The phrase sounded warmer, more inclusive, almost protective. But the more I heard it, the less certain I became about who the word "our" included. The moment I am least proud of came during preparation for a fundraiser video the year Chloe turned 12. She had already agreed to attend the event itself, but when she learned that the new video included old photographs from hospital visits, she asked to be removed. She did not throw a fit. She did not make a speech. She sat on the end of my bed one evening with the preview paused on my laptop and said she did not want strangers watching photographs of her when she had been sick enough that she could barely remember them. Elise explained the numbers to us. She did not threaten Chloe. She did not become the woman I saw standing in that hallway the morning the medication disappeared. She simply described how many families the previous campaign had helped and how much more the foundation hoped to raise that year. To Elise, those numbers settled the question. The video was effective. Effective meant useful. Useful meant justified. And I helped her. I told Chloe we could ask them not to use certain photographs next time. I reminded her that the fundraiser might pay for medication and transportation for children whose parents were scared in all the same ways I had once been scared. I asked her if she could manage it one last time. She agreed because I asked. That distinction would haunt me later. The fundraiser succeeded. Donations came in. Families received assistance. Nobody watching from the outside would have called what happened a failure. But that night, after we got home, Chloe washed the event makeup off her face and changed into an old t-shirt. She sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, working on a poster design for school, and told me something so simple that I had no excuse for missing its meaning. I want people to know my name before they know I have seizures. I remember standing in her doorway with a pile of folded laundry against my chest. I remember wanting to tell her that most people meant well. I remember almost explaining again how many children the foundation had helped. This time I did not. Still, silence was not the same as changing anything. The campaigns continued. The archive kept growing. Chloe became 13, and the little girl holding a purple handmade sign remained useful to adults who had built an institution around helping children like her. Somewhere between the first community center fundraiser and the polished foundation office we walked into that morning, a permission that had once been treated as temporary had become something everyone expected to continue, unless someone fought hard enough to stop it. Grandpa saw that before I did. In the final months of his life, he stopped looking only at how much money a campaign raised and started asking what had been agreed to before it was launched. He became quieter whenever Chloe's photograph appeared in materials she had not seen. Once, after Elise described a new donor presentation as another chance to tell our story, I saw Walter look across the table at Chloe instead of at Elise. He did not confront anyone in front of me that day. He only asked Chloe whether she had seen the presentation. She had not. The expression on his face stayed with me. It was not anger yet. It was recognition. The man who had first put his granddaughter's photograph on a fundraiser brochure was beginning to understand that good results had allowed all of us to stop asking a basic question. Do we still have permission? By the time Chloe and I returned home after the emergency department, that question felt different. She went upstairs to lie down while I carried our things inside. The cardboard box Grandpa had left for us was in the back of my car. Marcy had brought it out shortly after we arrived at the foundation that morning, before the medication went missing, and I had forgotten it was there until I opened the trunk. The box smelled faintly of paper, and the peppermint gum Grandpa kept in his desk. Inside were photographs, a few printing samples from his old company, folders from the earliest years of the foundation, and one of Chloe's original handmade fundraiser signs, with the purple stars faded around the edges. Near the bottom, I found a photocopy of the first release I had signed in 2019. My signature was exactly where I remembered putting it. So was the 1-year term. Someone had circled it in dark ink. Below it, in my father's handwriting, were 5 words. Ask why this became permanent. The 5 words in Grandpa's handwriting stayed on the photocopy long after I had lowered the rest of the papers back into the box. Ask why this became permanent. I sat at the dining room table, while the early afternoon light moved slowly across the floor. Upstairs, Chloe was sleeping after the longest morning either of us had had in months. Her original fundraiser sign lay beside me. The purple marker faded now. The cardboard soft at the corners from 7 years of being moved from office to storage box and back again. On the other side of it was the release I had signed in 2019. 1 year. The words were clear enough that I did not need a lawyer to explain them. Until that afternoon, I had thought Grandpa's last weeks had been mostly about his health, the foundation, and the normal worry that came with getting older. I knew he had been asking more questions. I knew he and Elise had disagreed. I had even heard him complain once that the foundation had grown faster than its paperwork. What I had not understood was how many different questions he had been asking at the same time. The first change had come in July. Grandpa had stepped away from the foundation's daily operations about 1.5 years earlier, but he had never left the board. He was still its chair and one of its voting directors. Elise ran the staff, fundraising, programs, and daily decisions as executive director. Most of the time, that arrangement suited both of them. Grandpa liked seeing something he had started become large enough that it no longer depended on him showing up every morning. Elise liked being trusted to run it. By that summer, trust had made everyone comfortable. I learned later from board materials in Grandpa's box that the July meeting had begun like dozens before it. Elise presented program numbers. Transportation assistance had increased. Medication grants were reaching more families. Donor retention remained strong. The financial summaries did not look like a charity collapsing or a woman stuffing cash into a suitcase. That was part of what made the problem easy to miss. One category bothered Grandpa. Community outreach and consulting costs had climbed sharply. On the summaries, the increase could be explained by growth. More programs meant more outreach. More outreach meant more outside help. Elliot Vance, the board treasurer, apparently saw it that way at first. His notes in the packet treated the difference as something to watch, not something alarming. Grandpa did something simple. He asked to see the source invoices. That request changed the tone. I remembered a Sunday lunch around that time when Elise arrived late and spent most of the meal answering messages from work. Grandpa asked her whether the accounting staff had pulled the records he wanted. Elise said they were working on it and reminded him that the foundation was no longer the tiny project he could audit from a kitchen table. She was not rude. Neither was he. But the silence that followed was different from the usual quiet between people who had nothing else to say. I tried to smooth it over. That was another habit I had to admit about myself. When two people I loved became tense, I instinctively searched for the harmless explanation. Elise was busy. Dad was getting older. The organization had grown. Everyone was tired. Grandpa did not argue with me. He just said that growth was the reason records mattered more, not less. At the time, I heard a businessman speaking. I did not hear a warning. In early August, Walter hired Gavin Price, a forensic accountant. The engagement letter was in the box, dated weeks before Grandpa died. He had not hired Gavin secretly with foundation money or pretended the board had approved something it had not. The letter showed that Grandpa retained him to review records. Grandpa was entitled to inspect as board chair and director. I never sat in a room with Gavin while he worked. Anything I learned about that review came later from the documents Grandpa kept and the records I was eventually shown. That distinction mattered to me. I did not want memory to turn into certainty simply because I wished I had noticed more. The first irregularities were small enough to sound boring. One invoice number appeared twice. A consulting charge described as Community Outreach Strategy had no report, presentation, schedule, or other work product attached to it. Several descriptions were almost identical, even though the invoices covered different months. None of that proved theft. Businesses made clerical mistakes. People uploaded the wrong file. Vendors reused descriptions. Grandpa knew that as well as anyone. He had spent decades running a commercial printing and packaging company before selling most of his ownership. He understood invoices better than I ever would. What bothered him was not one mistake, it was repetition. He asked for the supporting records behind several payments. Some existed, others did not. A few expenses that looked separate on monthly summaries began to resemble the same work billed more than once when Gavin compared the underlying paperwork. Still, Grandpa did not call Elise a thief. That was important. Even in his own handwritten notes, he used words like verify, reconcile, missing support. He wrote questions in the margins instead of conclusions. The more carefully he looked at money, the more he started looking at everything else the foundation had learned to treat as routine. That led him back to Chloe's campaign authorization. The system said renewal confirmed, but the folder held no 2026 signature from me. In the margin, Grandpa had written, "Where is Renee's signature?" Elise's explanation in his notes was that I had verbally approved continued use and that Chloe remained supportive. I could not swear I had never casually agreed to older uses, but I knew I had never signed the new campaign. By then, Chloe was 13, and the foundation's own policy also required her assent. The records did not contain that either. The pattern was becoming familiar. The system recorded permission more confidently than the paper behind it could support. I began remembering small things from the summer differently. Grandpa asking Chloe whether Elise had shown her a new campaign draft. Grandpa calling me one evening to ask when I had last signed anything for the foundation. The way he had gone quiet when I told him I could not remember. At the time, those questions had seemed disconnected. Now they sat inside the same cardboard box. Money, consent. Records that said something had happened when the paper behind them did not show that it had. By late August, Grandpa had begun working with Denise Harper, the outside lawyer the board used for nonprofit governance matters. The packet they prepared was there too. The top page carried a large printed label that made its status impossible to misunderstand. Proposed. Board action required. That phrase appeared more than once. There was no secret resolution signed by Walter that magically changed everything before he died. No hidden document that removed Elise with the stroke of a pen. What Grandpa and Denise had drafted were changes the board still needed to consider. Stronger consent controls, independent review of certain vendor relationships and payments, clearer documentation requirements, a board committee that would not rely only on reports coming through the executive director's office. He had also properly called a special board session to discuss them. The meeting scheduled after the estate briefing that afternoon was not something Elise had invented after his death. Grandpa had put it in motion himself. That discovery made the email Chloe had shown me in the hospital parking garage feel heavier. Youth Story Consent Review. Chloe Callahan present. He had not placed Chloe on the agenda as decoration. He had begun questioning whether the foundation had replaced permission with habit, and he wanted the board to hear from the person whose face had carried so much of its message. The financial questions were becoming harder to dismiss, too. Gavin's later notes did not contain a complete answer. Grandpa died before the review was finished. But by September, the pattern was no longer one duplicated invoice and one missing report. Multiple outreach bills over nearly 2 years showed repeated invoice numbers, copied descriptions, or payments with little documentation showing what service had actually been delivered. The total associated with the questionable vendor activity was large enough that Grandpa stopped treating it as a bookkeeping annoyance. Somewhere between $180,000 and $200,000 appeared in the cluster Gavin was reviewing. I stared at that number for a long time. The foundation's annual budget was measured in millions by then. $200,000 would not make the organization vanish overnight. But it was far too much money to wave away as a misplaced receipt. The document still did not tell me where the money had ultimately gone. Gavin had not finished tracing it. I had no bank records in front of me, proving who benefited. Grandpa's notes did not say Elise stole anything. What they did show was that he believed the questions had grown serious enough that they should no longer remain only inside the family or inside the foundation. In the middle of September, before he died, he sent an initial referral package outside. I found the transmission record clipped behind Gavin's engagement paperwork. The date was unmistakable. It had been sent while Grandpa was alive. That mattered because it changed the story I had begun constructing in my head. The police were not something he had arranged to burst into a room after his death like a final act of revenge. He did not know what investigators would conclude. He did not know whether they would find wrongdoing, or bad management, or some mixture of both. He had simply reached the point where he no longer trusted the organization to investigate itself. And then, before he could finish what he had started, his time ran out. The last conversation I personally witnessed between Grandpa and Chloe about the foundation happened only days before his death. He was sitting in his den with a blanket over his knees, despite the house being warm. Chloe had brought him a redesign of a school poster she was working on. The two of them could spend 20 minutes discussing typefaces without either noticing anyone else in the room. I was sorting mail nearby when Grandpa asked whether she still wanted to speak at the board meeting. Chloe said she did. She did not give him some polished speech about privacy or ownership. She told him she was tired of seeing pictures of herself that she had forgotten existed. Then, she admitted, she felt bad because the campaigns raised money. Grandpa listened longer than he usually did. I expected him to reassure her that the foundation needed her, or tell her how proud he was. Instead, he rubbed his thumb along the edge of her poster and said something I understood only after finding the papers in his box. He told her he had confused being proud of something with being willing to keep doing it. Chloe looked at him as if she was not sure whether he was talking about her or himself. Maybe he was talking about both. There was no promise of money, no hint that he had secretly placed her above anyone else in his estate. He did not tell her he would fix everything. He only told her the board should hear the answer from her. A few days later, Walter Callahan died. His death was sudden enough that everything unfinished stayed unfinished. The special board session had not happened. Denise's proposed governance packet had not been voted on. Gavin's review remained open. Consent records had questions written beside them instead of corrections. Funeral flowers arrived faster than answers. For several days, none of us thought about invoices or board procedure. We chose photographs. We answered calls. My mother moved through the house as if she had forgotten what people did when there was no task left in front of them. Elise handled foundation messages and public statements because that was what she knew how to do. I watched her work and, even then, part of me was grateful she could. That was the terrible complication of everything I was learning. The person I had begun to fear was also the person who had helped Grandpa turn a folding table fundraiser into an organization that had paid for real medication, real transportation, and real care. Good things had happened. That did not make every choice used to create them good. After the funeral, while sorting messages related to Grandpa's files, I found an email he had sent before his death. It was not some message scheduled to arrive from beyond the grave. The timestamp placed it days earlier. He had sent it to people involved in the review. The sentence was short. "If I cannot chair the meeting, do not cancel Gavin's review." I read it at my kitchen table with the proposed governance packet open beside me. For the first time, I understood what Grandpa had actually left behind. Not a trap, not a victory. Work. He had found enough to become worried. He had asked questions. He had brought in someone independent. He had pushed the financial concerns outside the family. He had drafted reforms with Denise. Then he died before any of those reforms became real. I turned back to the first page of the packet. Proposed. Board action required. Those words felt colder now than any accusation could have. Because if Grandpa had lived, I could still have imagined him walking into that conference room, tapping his finger against the paperwork, and forcing everyone else to answer the questions he had started asking. But Grandpa was gone. Nothing in that box could vote. Nothing in his handwriting could remove an officer, repair a consent system, or make a board demand records it had spent years accepting on trust. Everything Walter wanted changed, still depended on the people who were alive, being willing to change it. By the time I finished going through Grandpa's papers, the clock on my kitchen wall was creeping toward 2. Chloe had been asleep upstairs for almost 40 minutes. I could hear nothing from her room, which was exactly what I wanted after the morning we had just survived. Her hospital discharge papers sat beside my laptop. The purple medication pouch was still missing. My father's proposed governance packet was open on the other side of the table, and between those two things sat a question I could no longer push away. What had Elise expected to happen if Chloe and I stayed home? The estate briefing was not the answer. Henry had already made it clear weeks earlier that nobody gained or lost inheritance rights by sitting in his conference room. If Grandpa had left Chloe something, Chloe would have it whether she was present or asleep in her own bed. If he had left her nothing, showing up would not change that either. So Elise's urgency had to be about what came afterward. I picked up my phone and called Elliot Vance. Elliot had been the foundation's treasurer for years. He was not someone I thought of as Elise's friend exactly, but he trusted her. Everyone on the board had trusted her. She had earned that trust by building systems that appeared to work. Donations came in. Grants went out. Budgets were delivered on time. When something grew quickly and looked successful from the outside, people tended to forgive the parts they could not see. I did not tell Elliot that I thought Elise had taken Chloe's medication. I still had no proof of that. I told him only what I could support. Chloe had experienced a breakthrough event that morning. Her medication pouch had disappeared inside the foundation building. We had just returned from the emergency department. Then I asked him what, exactly, the board planned to discuss after the estate briefing. There was a pause long enough for me to hear paper moving at his end. Elliot said the afternoon session covered several items Grandpa had placed on the agenda before his death. Governance questions, vendor oversight, a review of campaign permissions, and a planned update on the Foundation's next youth awareness campaign. That last phrase tightened something in my chest. I asked him to send me the board packet. He hesitated. Not because it was secret, he explained, but because I was not a director. I reminded him that the campaign involved my minor daughter, and that Grandpa had specifically placed Chloe on the agenda. A few minutes later, a stripped-down version of the relevant campaign materials landed in my inbox. I opened it at the kitchen table. The first slide used a recent photograph of Chloe. Not one from when she was 6. Not an old image already circulating from the first fundraiser. This one had been taken the previous spring at a foundation event. Chloe was standing beside Grandpa, looking down at something he had written on a program. The photograph was gentle, private almost. I remembered taking it because Walter had been teasing her about a font choice, and she had been trying not to laugh. Across the top of the slide were the words, 2026, 27 Continuing Youth Ambassador. Underneath, in smaller type, Guardian Renewal Confirmed. Youth Ambassador Continuing Support. I read the 2 lines again. Then I went upstairs. Chloe was awake, lying on her side with one hand tucked under the pillow. She looked better than she had at the hospital, but not well enough for me to pretend the morning had not happened. Her color had returned, her speech was normal. She was tired in the heavy, slow way that made every movement deliberate. I sat on the edge of the bed and showed her the slide. She stared at it for several seconds. She had never seen it. That answer did not come in the form of outrage. Chloe simply took my phone, enlarged the photograph, and studied the page as if she might find some small detail, proving she had forgotten agreeing to it. Then she handed the phone back. The campaign was scheduled to launch the following week. Her face was already in the deck. Her support had already been written into the presentation as a fact. I went downstairs and called Elliot again. This time I asked where the words, Guardian Renewal Confirmed, had come from. He did not know immediately. I heard him clicking through something on his computer. Then he said the campaign summary had been prepared through Elise's office. The information given to the board was that I had verbally approved continued use, and that Chloe remained willing to serve as youth ambassador. I felt an odd calm come over me. Not relief, not anger. The kind of stillness that arrives when uncertainty finally narrows into something you can act on. I did not renew it. Those were the only words I needed to say directly. Elliot did not apologize. He did not suddenly become my ally. In a strange way, I respected that. He asked whether I had sent anything in writing withdrawing or declining renewal for the new campaign. I had not. For years, I had treated foundation permissions the way people treat favors inside a family. A text, a conversation in a hallway, a vague agreement after an event. I had trusted that if I said Chloe was uncomfortable, people who loved her would hear the meaning behind it. That morning had taught me what happened when the record belonged to someone else. Elliot told me to put my position in writing and copy Denise Harper, the board's outside nonprofit counsel. So I did. I sat at the kitchen table with Grandpa's old one-year release beside me and wrote the clearest email I had written in years. I stated that I had not signed or authorized any renewal for a new 2026-27 campaign. I did not authorize new campaign use of Chloe's name, photographs, or medical story. Chloe had not provided the youth assent required under the Foundation's own policy. Any statement describing either of those things as confirmed was inaccurate. I sent it to Denise, Elliot, and the board address. Then I saved a copy. The timestamp was 2:17 p.m. That small line of numbers mattered to me more than I expected. For once, there would be no discussion later about what I had meant, what Elise thought she heard, or whether I had seemed agreeable after some fundraiser months before. At 2:26, Denise replied. Her response was short and careful. She acknowledged receipt. She said the board could not treat Elise's representation as verified authorization in light of my written notice, and that the campaign consent item would have to be addressed accordingly. Nothing dramatic happened. No sirens. No legal threat. No triumphant declaration. Just an email. And yet, sitting there, I realized I had just removed the one advantage Elise may have thought our absence would give her. Even if Chloe stayed home, my answer was now inside the board record. She could not truthfully tell them that the guardian renewal was confirmed. Chloe's choice mattered too, but in a different way. The Foundation's youth policy required her assent for the campaign they were planning. She did not have to drag herself into a conference room to create some magical legal protection. Her rights did not depend on whether she could stand upright at 4 o'clock that afternoon. That was when Elise's plan, or at least the shape of it, began to make sense. If Chloe had become too unwell to attend, I would have stayed with her. If I had stayed with her, neither of us would have been in the room when Elise presented the campaign as already approved. The board could have moved on to the launch schedule. Donor teams could have received the materials. Vendors could have been told to proceed. Announcements could have been made. None of those things would have turned a false statement into a valid release. But they would have changed the practical fight. Instead of stopping something before it happened, I would have been trying to undo something that Elise could describe as already underway. People behaved differently once a decision looked finished. They worried about wasted printing costs, donor confusion, embarrassment, deadlines, promises already made. They started asking whether one person's objection was worth disrupting everything. Elise had spent years building an organization. She understood momentum better than anyone. I went upstairs again around 2:30. Chloe was sitting up now, drinking water and drawing absent-mindedly on the edge of an old envelope. I told her the written notice had been sent. I told her she did not need to go anywhere to make my decision valid. If she wanted to stay home, I would stay with her, and nobody could honestly claim I had renewed permission. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked whether the board would still talk about her. I told her probably. She looked down at the envelope in her lap. She had drawn the same word 3 times, in different lettering styles. No. That was when I understood why she still wanted to go. It was not because she thought Grandpa had left her money. It was not because she wanted to confront Elise. She wanted the people who had spent years discussing her story to hear an answer from the person the story belonged to. I checked the time. We had more than an hour before we needed to leave. I told her we would not decide yet. She needed rest first. If she felt even slightly wrong again, the meeting was over before it started. Chloe accepted that without fighting me. For the next hour, nothing happened. That was exactly what I needed. No new aura. No confusion. No sudden weakness. She ate half a sandwich, drank more water, and stretched out again. I stayed nearby, watching without hovering so closely that she would feel watched. The hospital had discharged her because she had returned to baseline and had no red flags requiring admission. I trusted that assessment, but I also trusted my own eyes. She was tired. She was also herself. At a little after 3, Elise called. Her voice had changed since the hospital parking garage. The urgency was gone. In its place was the soft, practical tone she used with donors when a problem threatened to become visible. She had apparently heard there was some confusion over the campaign paperwork. She told me we did not need to turn it into a crisis. The forms could be corrected next week. Everyone was grieving. Chloe had been through enough for one day. The responsible thing, Elise suggested, was to stay home and deal with the rest later. We can fix the paperwork next week. That sentence stayed with me. The campaign launch was next week, which meant waiting until next week was not neutral. I asked whether any materials had already been prepared. Elise did not answer directly. She talked instead about how expensive last-minute changes could be and how the foundation had commitments to partners. She said the board meeting was already complicated enough because of Grandpa's death. There was no reason to add a family misunderstanding to it. A family misunderstanding. That was what my daughter's missing medication had become in the space of a few hours. That was what a campaign deck containing a false statement about my permission had become too. I did not accuse Elise of taking the pouch. I did not tell her what I had found in Grandpa's box. I did not mention Gavin's review or the questions in my father's handwriting. I only told her that my written position was already with Denise and the board. The silence on the other end lasted less than 2 seconds. It was still long enough for me to notice. After that, Elise returned to Chloe's health. She said a 13-year-old who had spent the morning in an emergency department did not belong in a meeting room. For once, I agreed with half of what my sister was saying. Chloe's health mattered more than the meeting. What I no longer trusted was Elise's reason for caring. When the call ended, I stood by the kitchen window and watched a few dry leaves scrape across the driveway. I thought about the version of events Elise had prepared for the board. Guardian renewal confirmed. Chloe continuing support. Neither statement had been properly verified. Yet the campaign was close enough to launch that Elise was already talking about the cost of changing it. That meant she had built more than a presentation around the assumption that Chloe would continue cooperating. The only thing I did not know was how much more. At 3:20, I checked Chloe again. She had changed into clean clothes and brushed her hair. The hospital wristband was still on because neither of us had thought to remove it. She looked at it, then at me, and asked whether wearing it would make people think she was trying to prove something. The question cut deeper than it should have. A child who had spent the morning in an emergency department was worried that evidence of being there might look dramatic. I found a pair of scissors and offered to cut the band off if she wanted. Chloe looked at it once more and shook her head. She was not going to hide it either. We left the house a little after 3:30. I drove slowly. Chloe sat with the seat slightly reclined, her water bottle between her knees, and her phone turned face down in her lap. I had already decided we would stay only as long as necessary. If she became tired, uncomfortable, or simply changed her mind, we would leave. Henry Sloane's office was in a quiet professional building on the north side of Columbus, the kind of place with polished stone floors, muted artwork, and receptionists who spoke softly because almost everyone waiting there was dealing with money, death, divorce, or some combination of the three. We arrived around 3:40. Henry came out briefly to make sure we understood the order of the afternoon. He would handle Walter's estate briefing first. The foundation session afterward belonged to Denise and the board. The two matters were connected by timing and by Walter's charitable gift, but they were not the same proceeding. I appreciated the distinction. Too many people in my family had begun talking as if Grandpa's will were going to decide everything. It wasn't. Joan was already there. My mother looked exhausted. She had aged in the week since Dad died, in a way that had nothing to do with years. When she saw Chloe, her eyes immediately went to the hospital wristband. Concern crossed her face first. Then Elise stepped out of the conference room behind her. She stopped. It was a tiny reaction. So small I might have missed it before that day. Her shoulders held still. Her gaze moved from Chloe to me, then briefly to the folder in my hand. She had not expected us. Not really. Mom recovered first and came toward Chloe, asking quietly whether she should be there after the morning she had had. Chloe told her she was tired but okay. I could see Joan wanted to press the issue, but the receptionist called Henry away before the conversation grew. Elise did not ask Chloe how she felt. She asked whether I had brought anything for the board. I told her Denise already had what she needed from me. That was enough. Elise's mouth tightened, then relaxed again. While we waited, Chloe wandered a few feet toward a side table near reception, where someone had stacked foundation materials for the directors attending the session after the estate briefing. I was watching my mother fold and unfold a tissue when I heard paper shift behind me. Chloe had picked up a brochure. Her photograph covered the front. Not the 6-year-old photograph from the first fundraiser, the newer one from the campaign deck. Across the bottom was a printed launch date, next week. There were dozens of copies in the stack. Finished, trimmed, ready to distribute. Chloe ran one finger over her own face on the glossy paper. Then she looked at me. She didn't think she needed my answer. Chloe was still holding the brochure when Henry's receptionist called our names. For a moment, she did not move. Her thumb rested over the printed launch date, as if she could rub the ink away. The stack beside her was thick enough that I could see how far this had already gone. Someone had approved paper stock, quantities, printing, delivery. Someone had decided the campaign was real before my daughter had ever been asked whether she wanted to be part of it. I took one copy from her hand and slipped it into my folder. We did not confront Elise in the reception area. I could feel Chloe watching her, and I knew how easily the afternoon could turn into exactly the kind of family scene Elise would later describe as emotional confusion. I had already done the important thing. My written non-renewal had reached Denise and the board before the session. Chloe's lack of assent was in the record. The brochure could wait. Henry led us into the conference room just before 4. The room was smaller than I expected. A long walnut table filled most of it, with a speakerphone unit in the center, and legal pads set neatly at each place. The blinds were half closed against the weak October sunlight. My mother sat near one end, with a tissue folded into a square beneath her fingers. Elise had placed her foundation laptop beside her chair and her work phone face down on the table. A slim presentation folder sat on top of both. Chloe took the seat beside me. The hospital wristband was still around her arm. Henry began by making something clear that my family had blurred for weeks. This was not a ceremonial reading in which people had to be physically present to receive what Walter had left them. The will and related estate documents had already entered the probate process. Henry was there to explain the structure, answer practical questions, and make sure the family understood what would happen next. Nobody lost anything by missing the meeting. Nobody gained anything by attending it. I watched Elise while Henry said that. She did not react. Of course she didn't. Elise understood systems. She knew better than most of us that Chloe's physical presence had nothing to do with inheritance rights. Whatever she had wanted that morning, it had never depended on keeping Chloe away from the will itself. Henry moved through the estate carefully. He did not turn it into theater. Grandpa had built his personal wealth through the printing and packaging business he had sold most of years earlier. His estate was comfortable, but not some hidden empire. There were provisions for my mother, family assets divided according to the plan, and ordinary instructions about property and accounts that made Walter sound exactly like the man I remembered. Organized, practical, unwilling to leave someone else guessing where he had put a document. I listened, but part of my attention stayed with Chloe. She was quiet. Her hands were folded in her lap, and every few minutes, she shifted in the chair as fatigue settled deeper into her body. I had told her before we came in that she could leave at any point. She knew I meant it. Still, she stayed. Henry reached the section involving the foundation. Grandpa had left a charitable bequest of approximately $1.8 million to the organization. Henry also cautioned that the bequest still had to move through the estate process. It was not cash the foundation could simply spend that quarter. My mother lifted her head. Elise's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The money did not belong to her. It did not make her owner of the foundation. It did not give her a voting seat she did not already have. But I understood why the number mattered. The foundation had been part of Walter's life for 7 years, and even after everything he had begun questioning, he had not abandoned its mission. He had still chosen to direct a significant part of his personal estate toward the work. For Joan, that seemed to mean something else. She had spent the week after Dad died, worrying that his disagreements with Elise had become personal, that Chloe's complaints about the campaign had somehow divided the family in his final months. When Henry continued through the beneficiary summary, without assigning Chloe a separate gift, I saw my mother's shoulders lower. Relief. It hurt more than anger would have. She did not smile broadly. There was no cruel celebration. Just a small breath she had apparently been holding, followed by the faintest softening around her mouth. Elise noticed too, and then Henry finished. Chloe's name had not been called. There was no personal bequest, no separate fund, no hidden trust. No special voting seat attached to Grandpa's estate plan. Nothing that transformed Chloe into the secret center of Walter's fortune. My daughter sat very still beside me. I had known this was possible. So had she. We had talked about it in the car. Grandpa had never promised her money. What he had promised was a chance to speak to the board. But knowing that in advance did not stop the room's reaction from hurting her. Watching Joan relax and Elise smile made the absence of her name feel like a judgment, not because Chloe had expected money, but because Grandpa had spent his last weeks telling her that her voice mattered. Elise allowed herself a small smile. Unlike my mother, she was not misunderstanding the law. She knew the will did not control the nonprofit board. What relieved her was simpler. Grandpa had not created some personal source of leverage for Chloe outside the foundation. No direct seat. No condition attached to a gift. No private inheritance large enough to alter the balance of power in the argument waiting after the estate meeting. And the largest charitable gift in the plan was still going to the organization Elise ran. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I could feel Chloe looking at me. Then she asked the question quietly enough that only the people closest to us heard it. Was I wrong about Grandpa? I turned toward her. There were a dozen things I could have said to make the moment easier. I could have told her Grandpa must have left something somewhere else. I could have hinted that maybe another document existed. I could have promised an answer I did not have. I would have been doing exactly what the rest of the family had done for years, giving Chloe a comforting story instead of the truth. I don't know what he finished, I told her. I only know what he told you mattered. Her eyes moved toward the folder in front of me. Inside it was the agenda with her name on it. That was all I could honestly give her. Grandpa had wanted her voice in the room. He had not bought that voice with an inheritance. For some reason, that distinction made the moment feel more important, not less. Henry gave us a few minutes to absorb the estate information before moving on. There were practical questions from my mother about property and administration. I let most of them pass around me. Nothing in those answers changed the central fact. Walter's estate plan was what it was. The foundation would receive a substantial charitable gift, and whatever happened next inside that organization would not be decided by the will. It would be decided by governance, by records, by people. Henry closed his estate folder shortly after 5. That simple motion changed the room. His part was over. Denise Harper, who had been waiting nearby and joining the meeting for the nonprofit session, took the seat closer to the head of the table. A few directors were present in person, while others were prepared to participate remotely, according to the notice Grandpa had issued before his death. Elliot arrived with a binder under his arm and looked older than he had the last time I saw him. He gave me a small nod, then avoided looking at the brochure still sticking out of my folder. Elise opened her laptop. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed ready. The estate portion had given her something solid to stand on. Grandpa had not cut the foundation out of his plans. $1.8 million was still coming. Chloe had no secret inheritance. Renee Callahan had no sudden authority to walk into a boardroom and take over. I could almost see Elise settling back into the version of the afternoon she understood. A governance dispute, a paperwork problem, an upset sister, a tired child, all things she believed she could manage. Denise placed the proposed governance packet in front of the directors. Across the first page, in bold letters, were the same words I had seen in Grandpa's box. Board action required. That phrase mattered because nothing Walter had drafted was automatically effective. He had not removed Elise before he died. He had not secretly restructured the organization. The board still had to decide what to do with the questions he left behind. Denise began by separating the issues. Walter's charitable bequest belonged to the estate process Henry had just explained. The board's authority came from the nonprofit corporation and its bylaws. Consent records, vendor controls, and executive oversight were matters for this session. Elise listened with the stillness of someone waiting for her turn. I looked down at Chloe's hospital wristband. Only hours earlier, My sister had been trying to make sure neither of us entered this room. Now we were here. My written notice existed. Chloe existed. The brochure existed. Whatever Elise had expected to move forward without contradiction was about to have one. Then the conference room door opened. Henry's receptionist did not step all the way inside. She spoke quietly to Denise, who stopped reading and looked toward Henry. Something passed between them that I could not interpret. Henry stood. No one else did. The receptionist explained that 2 people from law enforcement were waiting outside and had asked to speak with Elise Callahan. The room changed in a way I felt before anyone reacted. My mother's fingers stopped moving over the tissue. Elliot looked toward Elise. Elise herself did not move for the first second or two. Then her hand slid from the laptop keyboard and rested flat on the table. Her eyes went to me. That look was so immediate that I understood what she thought. She thought I had called them. I almost wanted to laugh from the sheer impossibility of it. I had spent the morning in an emergency department. Until that afternoon, I did not even know the full shape of Grandpa's audit. I had never spoken to a financial crimes detective in my life. Denise asked Henry to let the visitors know they could come into the conference room long enough to identify who they needed and explain the purpose of their visit. There was no dramatic order to clear the room. Nobody started searching desks or opening files. Henry's office remained exactly what it was. A law office, not a police scene. A woman entered first. She wore plain clothes and carried herself with the calm, contained manner of someone who did not need to raise her voice to control a room. Behind her was another investigator whose identification referenced the Ohio Attorney General's charitable law work. The woman glanced around the table. Her eyes moved over Henry, Denise, Elliot, Joan, Chloe, me, and finally Elise. Then she asked the question, "Which one of you is Elise?" My sister's face changed. Not dramatically. The color simply left it. She identified herself. The woman introduced herself as Detective Carla Mendez with Columbus Police Financial Crimes and explained that she was working with the state investigator on an ongoing matter involving foundation finances. She did not announce that Elise was guilty. She did not start listing accusations. She did not produce handcuffs. She said they had a court-authorized warrant permitting them to take possession of specific foundation-issued electronic devices in Elise's possession. The laptop on the table, the foundation phone beside it, nothing about Chloe's medication, nothing about the purple pouch. I felt something inside me shift. Until that moment, some part of me had still assumed that if police ever became involved, it would be because of what happened that morning. Maybe Marcy had called someone. Maybe hospital staff had documented the missing medication. Maybe my own questions had traveled farther than I knew. But Carla had arrived too soon for that. This had already been moving. Elise asked to see the warrant. Carla provided what was required and kept the explanation short. The devices would be taken under the court order. They were not going to open the laptop at Henry's conference table or scroll through Elise's phone in front of the family. The devices would be secured and handled according to the scope of the warrant. Denise made it clear that Foundation Counsel represented the organization, not Elise personally, in any matter where their interests might conflict. Elise could contact her own attorney before any voluntary interview. No one yelled. That somehow made the scene more frightening. Elise closed the laptop herself. The click of the lid sounded louder than it should have. Carla watched while the device and foundation phone were identified and placed into evidence bags. The seals were marked. The process was methodical enough that there was nothing for Elise to argue with in the moment without an attorney. My mother stared at the bags as if they contained something alive. She whispered Elise's name once. Elise did not look at her. She looked at me. The expression was no longer surprise. It was accusation. I could almost hear the story forming in her head. Renee had been angry about Chloe. Renee had sent the email. Renee had shown up with the hospital wristband and a brochure in her folder. Renee had somehow turned a family dispute into police at the door. I shook my head once. Not because I owed her an explanation. Because for the first time that day, I wanted her to know she was looking in the wrong direction. Carla asked Elise to step outside with her, so they could discuss next steps privately and allow her an opportunity to contact counsel. Still no arrest, still no handcuffs, still no declaration of guilt. Just a court order and 2 sealed devices leaving the table where Elise had expected to present the next phase of the foundation. She stood. Her chair moved back with a low scrape against the floor. As she passed behind me, I could smell the faint perfume she had worn to Grandpa's funeral. For one strange second, I remembered being 10 years old and following that same sister through our parents' house because I thought she knew everything. Then she was gone from the room. The door closed. Nobody seemed to know what to do with the silence afterward. Elliot looked down at the governance packet. Joan pressed the tissue to her mouth. Chloe sat beside me, too tired to understand every legal detail but old enough to recognize that something much larger than a missing permission form had just entered the room. I looked toward Denise. She did not explain the warrant. She did not speculate. She only said that the board would need to proceed carefully and that whatever law enforcement was examining had to remain separate from assumptions about guilt. That was when Carla returned to the doorway. Elise was no longer beside her. The detective looked at me, probably because she had noticed the way Elise had stared in my direction before leaving. I said I had not contacted her unit. Carla gave the smallest nod. Then she said the one thing that made the entire afternoon rearrange itself in my mind. This started before your father died. This started before your father died. Detective Mendez did not stay long enough to explain more. She disappeared back into the hallway, and the conference room door closed behind her. For several seconds, nobody moved. Elise's empty chair remained pulled away from the table. The space where her laptop had been looked strangely clean now, just a rectangle of polished wood beside the presentation folder she had not been allowed to open. I kept hearing Carla's sentence, "Before your father died." That meant the warrant had nothing to do with the morning Chloe spent on the floor of the foundation office. It had nothing to do with the purple medication pouch. At least not yet. Whatever brought investigators to Henry's office had already been moving through channels I knew almost nothing about. Grandpa had not simply become suspicious. He had done something with that suspicion. Denise ended the foundation session shortly afterward. There was no point pretending the board could continue as though 2 investigators had not just removed the executive director's work devices. She reminded everyone that a warrant was not a conviction, and that the board had separate obligations regardless of what law enforcement eventually found. Elliot gathered his binder without looking at anyone. My mother sat in the same chair, until Henry quietly touched her shoulder and asked whether she wanted water. Chloe leaned against me. The strain of the day had finally caught up with her. Her eyelids were heavy, and the hospital wristband had left a faint red mark where she had been twisting it against her skin. Whatever questions I had about Elise, Grandpa, or the foundation could wait until my daughter was home. We left before Elise returned. That night, after Chloe was asleep, I stood in my kitchen and looked at 3 things spread across the table. Grandpa's photocopy of the 1-year release, the campaign brochure with Chloe's face on the cover, the proposed governance packet marked Board Action Required. For years I had thought of the foundation as one thing, a good thing, mostly. Grandpa's idea, Elise's work, Chloe's story, families receiving help. Now every piece seemed to have split apart. The mission could be good, while the people running it made bad decisions. A campaign could raise money while violating the child used to sell it. A board could be full of decent people and still fail at its job. And a woman could help hundreds of families, while investigators examined whether she had also taken money she had no right to take. I did not sleep much. The next morning, Denise called. She was careful from the beginning. She could not give me access to the investigators' files, and she would not speculate about what was inside the warrant affidavit. But because my written consent complaint was now part of a broader governance review, and because Grandpa's proposed reforms touched both campaign authorization and financial controls, there were facts the board needed to understand that could also be shared with me without pretending I was a director. Gavin Price would brief the board later that day. I was not invited to sit through every part of it. I did not need to be. What Denise later explained to me came down to 3 facts. The first was the simplest. Gavin had found the same invoice number used more than once. Not one typo buried in years of paperwork. A pattern. The second was worse. Some bills described outreach or consulting work that did not have the records you would expect if the work had actually been performed. No report, no schedule, no clear work product. In some cases, the descriptions looked copied from one billing period to another. Again, Gavin did not call that proof of a crime. He called it unsupported. The third fact was the one that had moved the matter outside the foundation. After Grandpa's referral, investigators had used their own lawful process to examine financial records. Gavin himself had not possessed when his review began. Denise did not show me those records. She did not give me account numbers or a copy of the police file. She told me only what the organization had been advised it needed to know. Investigators had found evidence that some of the money paid to the outreach vendor later moved in ways connected to personal credit card obligations and expenses associated with Elise. That was why this could no longer be treated as a disagreement over bookkeeping. The questionable payments Gavin had identified were close to $190,000 over nearly 2 years. I wrote the number on a scrap of paper while Denise spoke. $190,000. It looked enormous, sitting by itself. Then Denise gave me another number. The foundation's annual operating budget was about $2.4 million. That changed the scale without making the first number smaller. The organization was not an empty shell, built only to steal money. Millions of dollars had moved through legitimate programs, payroll, assistance, transportation, and other expenses. But nearly $190,000 was still enough that no responsible board could shrug and call it noise. I asked the question I had been afraid to ask. Were the families real? Denise understood immediately. Yes, the programs were real. The grants were real. The children were real. For some reason, that answer nearly broke me. It would have been easier if the entire foundation had been fake. If Elise had invented beneficiaries, fabricated success stories, and built a charity that existed only on paper, then the moral choice would have been simple. Tear it down, expose everything, protect Chloe, and let the rest burn. But that was not what Grandpa had built. The foundation had helped people. I knew some of them. A few hours later, Denise shared a redacted program verification summary showing that the core transportation and medication grants were real. I was not given beneficiary medical files or private case records I had no right to see. I did not need them to remember Teresa Boyd. I already knew her through foundation events, and she had spoken openly about the transportation help that got her son to repeated specialist appointments and the medication assistance that carried them through an insurance gap. I remembered Teresa standing beside me at one of those early events, holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands because she was exhausted, and telling Grandpa that the transportation grant meant she had stopped lying awake trying to decide which bill could wait. That help had been real. So had dozens of other grants. Hundreds of families had passed through foundation programs over the years. Staff members had returned phone calls, processed applications, arranged rides, connected parents to resources, and done the ordinary work nobody put on campaign posters. Elise had not imagined all of that. She had helped build it. I hated how much that mattered. Because every time I looked at Chloe's brochure, I wanted my anger to be clean. It wasn't. The same organization that had used my daughter's illness, without renewed permission, had also helped mothers who once sounded exactly like me. The same executive director, whose financial records were under investigation, had spent years becoming very good at raising money for children who needed it. And the same board that had allowed Elise too much room had signed off on programs that genuinely worked. Elliot called me late that afternoon. His voice sounded different from the man I had spoken to the day before. The confidence was gone. He told me he had spent years watching budget-to-actual reports, cash flow summaries, program spending, and monthly financial packages. On those reports, the outreach expenses had not seemed large enough to threaten the organization. Growth explained some increases. Elise's office supplied explanations for others. He had accepted those explanations because the overall numbers stayed within ranges he considered manageable. Grandpa had wanted source documents. Elliot had thought that was excessive, not improper, not forbidden, just friction. He admitted that word himself. Friction. Walter wanted invoices, deliverables, and support behind the summaries. Elliot had worried that forcing staff to produce every underlying record would slow down a growing organization. Now he had a duplicated invoice number sitting in front of him. There was nothing useful I could say to make him feel better. He had not taken the money. At least nothing I had seen suggested that. But oversight was his job. I had spent years thinking failures like this required one obvious villain. Someone dishonest, surrounded by responsible people who had been fooled. Grandpa's records were teaching me something uglier. Sometimes wrongdoing grew because several decent people each made one convenient decision. Trust the summary. Skip the supporting document. Approve the campaign. Assume the permission continues. Do not create unnecessary conflict. Move on because the mission is good. No single choice looked catastrophic by itself. Together, they created a place where one person could acquire more control than anyone had intended. By the second day after the warrant, Elise had retained her own attorney. That distinction became important immediately. Denise represented the foundation in governance matters. She did not become Elise's personal defense lawyer simply because Elise was executive director. Their interests were no longer automatically the same. Through her attorney, Elise denied criminal wrongdoing. The vendor, he said, had performed legitimate services. Financial relationships could look misleading when examined, without full context. Transfers investigators were examining had explanations that had not yet been presented. Gavin's work was incomplete. No criminal case had been proven. On one point, he was right. Nothing had been proven in court. I forced myself to remember that. Then the statement moved to Chloe. What happened at the foundation office was described as a family medical misunderstanding. I read that phrase twice. My daughter had searched for medication I knew I had packed. She had told me the room sounded far away. Her knees had given out in my arms. We had spent hours in an emergency department, replacing a dose that should never have disappeared. Family medical misunderstanding. It was extraordinary how many things could be made smaller by choosing the right words. I did not respond publicly. There was no public fight yet, and I had no interest in starting one. The purple pouch was still missing. I still could not prove who had taken it. So I kept the statement in my folder and waited for evidence instead of rage. My mother did not share that patience. She came to my house on the third day. Chloe was upstairs working on school assignments she had missed, and I met Joan in the kitchen. She looked exhausted in the way grief made people look after everyone else stopped bringing food. Her hair was pinned back badly. She had forgotten lipstick, something I had rarely seen in my entire life. For the first few minutes, she talked about Elise's lawyer and the investigation as if repeating words could make them less frightening. Then, she began talking about Grandpa. Your father built this to save children. It was one of the few sentences she said directly enough that I remembered every word. I told her I knew. That was the problem. If the foundation had been useless, I would not have been afraid of damaging it. Joan seized on that immediately. She reminded me of families whose transportation depended on grants, children whose parents could not absorb another prescription cost, Staff whose jobs existed because Walter and Elise had spent years persuading people to donate. She did not tell me Elise was innocent. That surprised me. Instead, she asked why everything had to become public before the board understood what happened, why I could not give the organization time, why Chloe's campaign dispute could not be handled quietly while the accountants and lawyers sorted out the rest. The fear beneath her words was obvious. She was not only afraid for Elise, she was afraid Walter's name would become shorthand for scandal. For a moment, I understood her completely. I imagined reporters using Chloe's photographs beside stories about missing money. I imagined donors deciding the easiest response was to walk away. I imagined a mother calling for transportation assistance next January and being told the program had been cut because people stopped giving. That possibility frightened me. I admitted it. Mom's face softened as if she thought she had finally reached the part of me she could persuade. But fear was not the same as an answer. The foundation had already spent years asking Chloe to absorb discomfort because helping other children mattered. Now my mother was asking me to absorb uncertainty for the same reason. The words were different. The bargain was not. I told her protecting the mission could not mean protecting every person who had power inside it. Joan left without agreeing. I watched her car pull away and wondered whether doing the right thing always felt this unclear, when innocent people were connected to the consequences. The answer arrived in my inbox the next morning. The message had gone first to the foundation board. Denise forwarded the relevant notice to me because the campaign dispute and the organization's governance response were now moving together. One of the foundation's major institutional donors was temporarily freezing a $420,000 bridge grant. The money had been intended for medication assistance and transportation programs in the next quarter. The donor was not canceling support permanently. Not yet. The notice required evidence that the foundation had functioning governance safeguards before the funds would be released. I stared at the number, $420,000, more than twice the amount under financial investigation. The foundation had reserves. Programs would not disappear the next morning. Nobody was going to arrive at the office and find the doors chained shut. Walter's $1.8 million charitable bequest did not solve the immediate problem either. It was still moving through probate and could not simply be pulled forward to replace a restricted next quarter grant. But the reserves were not endless. If the freeze lasted, some next quarter assistance would have to be delayed, reduced, or funded from money intended for something else. For the first time, the consequences were no longer theoretical. I thought about Teresa. I thought about the mother from the first fundraiser in 2019. I thought about myself sitting in insurance appeals years earlier, wondering how parents with fewer options survived the same system. Then I thought about Chloe upstairs. It would have been very easy for someone to place those two groups on opposite sides. My daughter on one side, needy children on the other. Choose. That was the trap Elise's way of thinking had created from the beginning. If Chloe wanted privacy, she was hurting the campaign. If the board demanded accountability, it might hurt fundraising. If anyone questioned the person producing results, they were threatening the mission. Good work had become a shield held in front of every bad decision. Late that afternoon, Denise called again. 3 of the remaining directors who had no personal interest in Chloe's claim or Elise's defense were organizing a temporary conflict committee. Its job would be to handle the civil claims, governance questions, and any decisions requiring independence while the investigations continued. The board was finally building the separation Grandpa had wanted. But Denise had one more piece of news. The foundation's liability insurer had been notified. Its representatives wanted to discuss the exposure created by the campaign consent issue and Chloe's medical incident. They were interested in a possible civil resolution with me. I looked across the table at the campaign brochure that still carried my daughter's face. For the first time since the medication disappeared, someone was preparing to put an actual price on making part of the problem go away. The first thing Denise made clear was that Elise was not offering me money. That distinction mattered. 3 disinterested directors had formed a temporary conflict committee, and the foundation's liability insurer had become involved. Because my complaint about Chloe's campaign use and the medical incident created potential civil exposure. Elise could not sit across from me, reach into foundation funds, and pay for silence. She did not control the committee, and she could not use donor money as a private bargaining chip. Denise explained all of that before anyone mentioned a dollar amount. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me, and Chloe's brochure turned face down beside it. The meeting was remote, because I did not want to drag Chloe into another office unless she needed to be there. Denise appeared on my laptop. Elliot joined for part of the discussion in his capacity as treasurer, but the actual authority came from the independent committee and the insurer. The proposed resolution sounded reasonable at first. That was what made it difficult. The foundation would remove Chloe's image and story from the current campaign immediately. Existing digital materials under its control would be taken down. New distribution would stop. The organization would begin an independent policy review covering campaign permissions and youth assent. There would also be civil compensation, approximately $200,000, placed in a protected account for Chloe, and handled in whatever form required proper approval because she was a minor. I stared at the number while Denise continued. $200,000 could become college, medical expenses, a cushion against years when insurance changed again. It could become choices Chloe would not otherwise have. The money would come through insurance arrangements tied to the civil claim, not from the medication assistance budget or a jar of donor contributions labeled for sick children. The agreement would also include a broad civil release and confidentiality provisions, but Denise was explicit about the limits. Nothing in it could stop me from cooperating with law enforcement, the Ohio Attorney General, or other regulators. If investigators asked questions, I could answer them. If they required documents, the settlement would not become a shield against that process. Elise would remain subject to interim restrictions while the board review continued. The proposal did not promise that she would stay executive director forever, but it did not guarantee her permanent removal either. That last part sat heavily with me. The offer could solve Chloe's immediate civil problem. Her image could come down. The false campaign authorization could be corrected. Money could be set aside for the harm already done. The organization could tell donors that the family dispute had been resolved. And then everyone could begin using the word resolved long before the institution had answered the harder question. How had this been allowed to happen? I asked Denise whether accepting the agreement would require me to say the board's consent system had worked. No. Would it require me to deny what happened with the missing medication? No. Would it determine whether Elise had committed a crime? Absolutely not. Those answers made the offer harder to reject, not easier. This was not someone sliding a dirty envelope across a table. It was lawyers and insurers doing what lawyers and insurers were supposed to do. Reduce uncertainty. Compensate harm. Limit civil exposure. Stop a dispute from spreading farther than necessary. For the first time, I understood how people could sign agreements they later struggled to explain. Sometimes the deal was not evil. Sometimes it was simply incomplete. I told Denise I needed time. She agreed. That afternoon, I printed the proposal and put it in a folder where Chloe would not stumble across it before I had decided how much she needed to know. I had spent years making decisions for her. Some had been ordinary parenting decisions. Others, I now understood, had involved parts of her story that should have included more of her voice. I did not want to repeat that mistake by hiding everything from her, but I also did not want to place $200,000, a frozen grant, a criminal investigation, and the future of a multi-million-dollar charity onto the shoulders of a 13-year-old. There had to be a difference between giving Chloe agency and making her responsible for fixing adult failures. That distinction became harder to maintain when the $420,000 grant freeze stopped being a number in an email and began changing conversations inside the foundation. The bridge grant had been intended to support medication assistance and transportation in the coming quarter. Reserves bought the board some time, but not unlimited time. Staff were reviewing what could be delayed if the donor did not release the funds. Nobody was canceling help the next morning, but planning had shifted from expansion to preservation. Chloe heard part of that discussion by accident. I was on the phone with Elliot in the kitchen when she came downstairs for water. I lowered my voice, but not quickly enough. She heard the words "grant freeze." Later that evening, she sat beside me on the couch, with her knees pulled against her chest. She asked what it meant. I could have lied and told her it meant nothing. Instead, I explained only what she needed. A large donor was waiting to see whether the foundation fixed its governance problems before releasing money that had been planned for future medication and transportation assistance. The foundation still had resources. No child was suddenly being abandoned because of one email. But if the problem lasted too long, some programs could feel it. Chloe looked at the floor. The silence stretched long enough that I knew where her mind had gone before she said anything. Is it because I said no? I hated that question, not because I did not know how to answer it, because I knew exactly why she thought it might be true. For years, adults had praised Chloe whenever her discomfort produced something useful, a good campaign, a successful fundraiser, a moving story. Now she had said no, and money was frozen. To a 13-year-old, the line between those events could feel brutally simple. I turned toward her. No. I made sure she looked at me before I continued. The grant was frozen because adults responsible for the organization had failed to give a donor confidence in how the foundation was being governed. Her answer, about her own image, had not created those failures. I did not pretend her choice existed in a world without consequences. The campaign delay was real. The scrutiny was real. The foundation might have to change things it had planned. But those consequences belonged to the adults who had built plans on permission they never had, not to the child who finally said no. Chloe nodded, but guilt did not disappear because I explained it correctly. Wounds built over years rarely did. The next day, Elise's position reached me through counsel. Her attorney had requested that certain civil issues be discussed with the conflict committee, and during one of those exchanges, Elise was allowed to join briefly with representation. I did not expect an apology. I did not get one. What I heard instead was something more powerful because I believed Elise genuinely meant it. She talked about the families waiting for assistance, the donor freeze, the staff trying to plan a quarter without knowing whether $420,000 would arrive. She spoke about medication costs, missed appointments, parents driving unreliable cars across counties for specialists. Then she said the sentence I knew she had been building toward. You're not punishing me. You're punishing children who need us. For several seconds I said nothing. The words hurt because they were aimed at the part of me Elise knew best. She remembered the mother I had been before the foundation existed. The woman making insurance calls. The woman checking medication bottles twice. The woman who knew how frightening it was when healthcare depended on money you did not have. She also knew I had spent years telling Chloe that helping those families justified one more photograph, one more event, one more piece of herself. Elise was using the oldest argument in our family. The good outcome matters more than the person paying the price. What frightened me most was how close it still came to working. That night I reread the settlement proposal. $200,000? Immediate image removal? A policy review? Restrictions on Elise? While the board continued its work? A civil release that did not stop criminal cooperation? If my only job had been to recover something for Chloe, I might have signed it. I imagined putting the money aside and closing the folder, taking Chloe out for breakfast the next morning, telling her the photographs were coming down, telling myself law enforcement could handle the rest. There was a version of that choice that looked responsible, maybe even kind. Then I imagined the foundation 6 months later, A press statement saying an unfortunate family disagreement had been resolved. New consent forms. A training session. Everyone promising to do better. And underneath it, the same habit of treating the mission as a reason not to examine how power had been used. The medication investigation might continue regardless, but the institution itself could still avoid saying what had happened inside its own walls. I was not ready to sign. Before I made the final decision, Teresa Boyd asked if she could speak with me. I knew immediately why the conversation mattered. Teresa was not a critic standing outside the foundation. Her son had benefited from it. Transportation support had gotten him to appointments when she could not afford to lose another day of work. Medication assistance had carried them through an insurance gap that might otherwise have forced choices no parent should make. If anyone had the right to tell me that damaging the foundation would hurt real families, Teresa did. We met at a quiet coffee shop. She looked exactly as I remembered her from years earlier, only more rested now. She brought no folder, no legal language, no attempt to tell me what I should do with the settlement. Instead, she talked about the day Grandpa approved help for her family. She remembered sitting in her car afterward and crying because someone had finally said yes before she had to prove she was desperate enough to deserve help. I listened. That story mattered. It was one of the reasons this entire fight hurt so much. Then Teresa surprised me. She said she had seen Chloe in campaigns for years. At first, she had assumed Chloe liked it. Everyone did. Chloe smiled in photographs. She attended events. Walter was proud of her. Elise always spoke about Chloe, as though she were part of the foundation's identity. Teresa told me that learning Chloe had wanted out made her rethink all of it. Then she said something I carried with me long after the coffee had gone cold. That does not mean Chloe owes you her face forever. She was not saying the foundation should close. She was not saying its programs were fake. She wanted the organization to survive because she knew what it had done for her son. But survival, in her mind, did not require pretending Elise was the mission. That difference mattered. For days I had been hearing the same question framed as a choice between two sides. Chloe or the children. Accountability or help. Truth or Grandpa's legacy. Teresa refused the choice itself. She believed the foundation could be worth saving and still need to change. Maybe that was the only way saving it meant anything. I went home and opened the settlement folder one final time. The $200,000 still looked like security. I did not become noble enough to stop seeing that. There are easier decisions to make when the thing you are refusing has no value. This had value. It could help Chloe. It could reduce uncertainty. It could end part of a fight I was already tired of having. But the offer treated what happened primarily as harm that could be compensated. I had begun to see it as something larger. A system had recorded permission that did not exist. A campaign had been printed before Chloe answered. A board had relied on executive summaries instead of checking source records. An organization built to help vulnerable children had become too comfortable deciding what one vulnerable child should tolerate for the greater good. If I signed away the civil dispute before the institution was forced to face that pattern, I was afraid the lesson would become narrower than the failure. I called Denise. My hands shook anyway. I told her I was declining the proposal in its current form. She did not argue. She reminded me that the decision could have financial consequences and that litigation carried uncertainty. The independent committee would continue reviewing its options. Nothing about my refusal changed my obligation to preserve evidence or the organization's duty to cooperate with investigators. I understood. Before the call ended, I added one sentence. "You are still trying to buy permission from my daughter." It was the closest I came to anger. The silence on the other end was brief. Then Denise said she understood why I felt that way. I closed my laptop and sat alone at the table. There was no surge of victory, no sense that I had defeated Elise. I had just turned down enough money to change my daughter's future because I believed there was a difference between compensating Chloe and repairing the system that had harmed her. That belief felt much cleaner in theory than it did with an unsigned agreement sitting in front of me. The next complication arrived almost immediately. The civil settlement was no longer the easiest path. Evidence would matter more now. The medication incident had become a separate line of inquiry, and the people reviewing it needed to understand the medical significance of what happened when Chloe's maintenance medication disappeared. A request came through the proper channels, asking whether we would authorize broader access to Chloe's medical history. Not just the emergency department record from that morning. Not just confirmation that she had epilepsy and a prescribed medication schedule. A wider set of records could show her history over time. Prior seizure patterns, treatment adjustments, past incidents, and the clinical context that might make the morning look more serious to anyone trying to evaluate harm. From a purely strategic point of view, I understood the appeal immediately. Give them everything. Make denial impossible. Show every seizure, every medication change, every frightening night, every hospital visit, every piece of Chloe's life that proved she was not milking it for attention. I felt the old instinct rise before I could stop it. Use the story because it helps. Only this time, the cause was mine. I could have told myself the exposure was different because I was protecting Chloe. I could have told myself medical records were evidence, not fundraising. But the question underneath it was painfully familiar. How much of my daughter should I give away? Because doing so might produce a better result. That evening, I sat beside Chloe at the dining room table. She was working on a typography assignment, moving letters around on her screen until the spacing pleased her. I waited until she finished before I explained the request. I told her nobody was asking her to make a public speech. This was about records that might be shared through legal and investigative channels. I explained that a broad release could include much more of her medical history than the single incident we were dealing with. Chloe stopped moving the cursor. She looked at me. For once, I did not tell her what answer would help other people most. I asked what she wanted. Her fingers rested on the edge of the laptop. All of them? All of them? Chloe's fingers had stopped moving on the edge of her laptop. I could see from her face that she understood what I had just asked better than I wanted her to. A broad medical release was not simply one doctor confirming that she had epilepsy. It could open years of records. Emergency visits, medication changes, notes written on the worst days of her childhood, details about seizures she barely remembered, and others she remembered too well. For a moment, the old instinct rose in me again. Give them everything. Make it impossible for Elise to dismiss what happened. Make every person who had ever called Chloe dramatic read what those episodes actually looked like. Then I heard my own thought for what it was. Use the story because it helps. The same argument had followed Chloe from the first fundraiser to the campaign brochure sitting face down on my table. I told her no one needed an answer that night. The next morning, after she had slept, we went through the request again. I explained what could be provided, without opening her entire medical history. A letter from her clinician could confirm her diagnosis, the fact that she was prescribed maintenance medication on a schedule, and why disruption to that schedule mattered. The emergency department record could document the breakthrough event that morning and the replacement treatment arranged after the medication disappeared. Those pieces would answer the immediate question. They would not tell strangers everything that had ever happened to her. Chloe listened carefully. She asked whether investigators would still believe her if she did not release more. That question hurt in a different way. She had already learned to assume belief was something she had to purchase with exposure. I told her I could not promise what every person would think. But evidence did not become stronger simply because we surrendered more of her life than the issue required. She looked down at her hands. Then she said she was willing to provide the clinician letter and the records from that day. Nothing more. I did not ask her to reconsider. That mattered to me. Not because I had suddenly become a perfect mother who understood every boundary. I had spent years getting this wrong. I had signed the first release. I had encouraged one last fundraiser video. I had told Chloe that discomfort was sometimes the cost of helping people. The difference was that this time, when she placed the boundary, I did not move it. Denise helped make sure the records traveled through the proper channels. Chloe's clinician provided a short statement confirming the diagnosis, the prescribed maintenance schedule, and the medical significance of the breakthrough event and replacement dose. The emergency department documentation covered what happened after the medication went missing. No full childhood history, no collection of private episodes just to make Elise look crueler. The medical branch of the investigation would have what it needed to understand the incident without turning Chloe's body into a public exhibit. Chloe also agreed to provide a limited written statement. She wrote it at our dining room table. There was no speech, no dramatic declaration. She wrote that she had not agreed to continue as youth ambassador for the new campaign. She wrote that her medication pouch had been inside her tote before we went into the foundation office that morning. She described where the tote had been left in the prep room. She described discovering the pouch was missing. She wrote what she remembered feeling before the breakthrough event. Then she wrote down Elise's words. She's milking it for attention. Chloe stared at that sentence for a long time after typing it. I did not ask what she was thinking. Some moments did not improve when an adult rushed to fill them. When she finished, the statement was short. That was exactly the point. It belonged to her. While Chloe decided what medical information she was willing to share, other parts of the case began moving, without requiring anything more from her. 2 days later, Denise confirmed the paper trail we had already suspected. The original 1-year release was still in the file, but there was no signed 2026 renewal from me and no youth assent from Chloe. Even so, the internal workflow marked the campaign as renewed and traced that representation through Elise's office. Denise did not call the entry a forgery or treat it as proof of criminal intent. For the board, the narrower conclusion was enough. The campaign had moved forward on authorization the foundation could not support. I thought about all the years I had feared, that if I did not hand over every piece of Chloe's medical life, people would say we were exaggerating. Instead, one of the strongest facts had nothing to do with her medical records. A form existed. It had an expiration. No replacement signature existed. The system had recorded something the paper did not support. The next call came from Denise late that afternoon. This one was about the prep room. I stood in my kitchen while she explained what the security review had established. The badge system had preserved access logs automatically. I had noticed the reader the first morning because Marcy had used it to let us into the room. At the time, it was only a detail. Now there was a timestamp attached to it. The log showed who used authorized access during the relevant window. Elise had entered the prep room. Alone. The hallway camera had also retained footage. I was not given the raw video to study frame by frame. It was part of a preserved review, and investigators were involved now. Denise summarized only what could be responsibly shared with me. The camera showed Elise going into the prep room during the period after Chloe left her tote there. A short time later, she came back out. In her hand was a small purple object consistent in size and appearance with a zippered pouch. The camera could not show the pharmacy label. It could not prove from pixels alone that the object was Chloe's medication pouch. There was no impossible close-up where the truth became visible in perfect resolution. Just a woman entering a controlled room and leaving with something purple in her hand. A piece, not the whole answer. Marcy's statement added another piece. The same staff coordinator who had led us to the prep room had now formalized what she remembered. Elise had been the person who told staff to let Chloe and me use that room to leave our things. Later, during the relevant period, Elise went into it without us. Marcy had looked uncomfortable that morning when I asked who could enter. Now I understood why. She had not known what happened, but she knew enough to realize the access pattern mattered. It also gave new weight to the detail I had almost dismissed that morning. Elise had called it a purple medication pouch before I had ever told her what color it was. Still, none of it gave me the one thing I wanted most. The pouch itself. For days, part of me had imagined it sitting in a trash can somewhere, emptied and gone. Maybe we would never find it. Maybe everything would depend on logs, footage, timing, and testimony forever. Then Denise told me something I had not been cleared to know earlier. The day after the meeting, Foundation Facilities staff had opened a sealed carton in a staff-only storage area while sorting event materials. Security documented the recovery immediately, and I was only being told now, after investigators had taken custody and counsel could brief me. Inside the carton was a purple zip pouch, with Chloe's pharmacy label still attached. Nobody called me to come identify it in person. Nobody handed it to me so I could hold it dramatically and recognize the loose thread I remembered from that morning. That was not how evidence should be handled. The facilities worker stopped once the labeled pouch was visible. Security was notified. The location and time were documented. The carton and pouch were preserved rather than passed around the office. The material was then turned over through the appropriate chain for investigators to handle. When Denise told me, I had to sit down. For days, I had replayed that morning in my head. My hand pulling the zipper closed before we left home, Chloe emptying her tote. The sound of her saying everything in the room felt far away, her knees giving out, Elise watching. Now the pouch had been found inside the same institution where it disappeared, hidden among event materials in an area my daughter never had reason to enter. I wanted the discovery to feel like victory. It did not. It felt like confirmation that something I had been trying not to believe had become harder to avoid. Even then, Denise would not let the board leap beyond the evidence. The pouch's location did not prove by itself who placed it there. The camera did not prove what Elise intended. The badge log did not prove why she entered the room. Marcy's statement did not prove what happened once the door closed. Each piece had limits. Together, they formed a chain strong enough that the medication incident could no longer be brushed aside as a family misunderstanding. That was the difference. The investigation now had a serious branch involving Chloe's missing medication, not because Chloe had surrendered every medical record she owned, because independent systems had preserved what adults did: badge access, hallway footage, internal records, timestamps, a recovered pouch, a staff statement. The truth was beginning to take shape without requiring my daughter to bleed privacy into every empty space. I thought about how backward I had understood evidence for most of my life. As a photographer, I trusted what I could see. But one image rarely told the entire story. A photograph could show Elise holding something purple. It could not tell us why. A log could show her entering a room. It could not show what she thought. A recovered pouch could prove where it ended up. It could not speak. Strength came from the pieces agreeing with each other. And for the first time, the pieces were beginning to agree. Elliot understood that too. By then, he had reviewed enough of the consent records to see that the problem was larger than one campaign slide. Executive summaries had been accepted without enough checking. The board had relied on statements that should have been tied back to signed records. He did not try to excuse that anymore. What I noticed most was that he had stopped talking about Elise's intentions. Earlier, people kept asking whether she meant well, whether she believed she was helping, whether she thought I had verbally agreed. Now Elliot was looking at systems. Did the signature exist? No. Did the youth assent exist? No. Did the campaign deck say both were effectively settled? Yes. Sometimes accountability became clearer when people stopped asking whether someone felt like a bad person and started asking whether the process they controlled had told the truth. A few days later, Denise asked if I wanted to see one additional item from Grandpa's governance file. It was not new evidence about the medication. It was not a message accusing Elise. Walter had written the memo to counsel before his death while reviewing the Foundation's consent practices. I read it slowly. He acknowledged that the culture around Chloe's story had developed partly because he allowed it to. He had been proud of the Foundation's growth. He had been proud of his granddaughter. Somewhere along the way, he had let those two kinds of pride become permission. He wanted the board to review not only whether forms had been completed correctly, but whether the organization had learned to treat familiar children as permanent assets of the mission. The memo did not rescue him. I was grateful for that. I did not need another story where Grandpa secretly understood everything and left perfect instructions for the rest of us. He had made mistakes. So had I. The value of the memo was not that Walter had been right all along. It was that he had finally recognized part of what he had helped create. He had started trying to correct it before he died. That was all. The living still had to decide whether to continue. By the end of the second week after his death, the Temporary Conflict Committee had enough information to move the governance process forward. 3 disinterested directors exercised their authority under the bylaws to call a special board meeting with the required 48-hour notice. The agenda was specific: officer suspension or removal, interim controls, expansion of the independent audit, consent safeguards, no language about convicting Elise, no board declaration that she had committed a crime. Those decisions belonged elsewhere. The board had a different question. Could she continue holding executive authority over the institution while all of this remained unresolved? Denise called to tell me that Chloe and I would be invited for the relevant portion of the meeting. We were not directors. We would not vote. Chloe's written statement could be read with her permission, so she would not be forced to repeat the morning in front of everyone, unless she chose to speak. I told Chloe that. Her first question was whether she had to go. No. Her second was whether the board could still act if she did not tell them everything. I looked at the clinician letter on the table, the limited emergency record, her short statement, the expired 1-year release, the missing renewal, the badge log summary, the camera review, the recovered purple pouch. All of those pieces existed because systems and people had recorded what happened when none of us knew how important the details would become. I told her yes. This time, her whole life did not have to become the price of being believed. That evening, Denise called one final time with the attendance list. Walter's death had left 6 voting directors. Under the bylaws, 4 were required for a quorum. I expected at least one person to stay away. Someone afraid of legal exposure. Someone loyal to Elise. Someone who did not want their name attached to whatever happened next. Denise read through the confirmations, one by one. When she reached the end, I stopped writing. All 6 remaining directors had confirmed attendance. 48 hours later, every chair that mattered was occupied. Some directors were physically in the conference room. The others appeared on the large screen at the far end of the table, their faces divided into small squares beneath the foundation logo. Walter's seat remained empty. No one had moved it. For the first time since his death, that empty chair did not feel symbolic to me. It felt practical. There were 6 voting directors left, and all 6 had shown up to make a decision. Walter could no longer make for them. Chloe sat beside me. She had asked to come. I had made sure she understood that she did not need to. Her written statement could have been read without her in the room. She was not responsible for convincing anyone. She was not going to vote. Neither was I. We had been invited only for the part of the meeting concerning her consent, the campaign, and the medication incident. She came anyway. Not because she wanted revenge. She wanted to see whether the adults who had talked about her for years could finally make a decision without demanding more from her first. Denise opened the meeting by doing something that would have bored me 2 weeks earlier. She explained the rules. There were 6 remaining voting directors after Walter's death. 4 were required for a quorum. All 6 were present or properly participating remotely. Any conflicts were noted. The special meeting had been called by 3 disinterested directors with the required 48-hour notice. Elise was there because the proposed actions affected her position as executive director. She was not a director. She did not have a vote. That distinction hung in the room more heavily than I expected. For years, Elise had been the face people associated with running the foundation. She hired staff. She cultivated donors. She presented the numbers. She knew every campaign schedule and every important relationship. But authority inside a nonprofit was not the same thing as being the person everyone listened to most. That afternoon, the people with votes were sitting around the table. Elise sat beside her personal attorney. She looked composed. Not cold, not frightened. Prepared. That was the Elise I had known most of my life. When something threatened to become chaotic, she organized herself. Her notes were lined up beside her. A glass of water sat untouched near her right hand. She wore a navy jacket I had seen at donor meetings before. If someone had entered without knowing why we were there, they might have assumed Elise was about to give another presentation. Maybe, in her mind, she was. Gavin went first. He did not rebuild the entire audit for a room that had already received the reports. He summarized the 3 points that mattered: the duplicated or unsupported invoice pattern, the nearly $190,000 in questioned vendor payments, and the financial trail investigators had independently corroborated after Walter's referral. He did not call Elise guilty or tell the board what criminal charges should exist. He explained only why the matter could no longer remain an internal accounting concern. Elise's attorney responded carefully. The vendor had performed real work, he said. Documentation could be incomplete without services being imaginary. Transfers that looked suspicious could have legitimate explanations once all records were reviewed. The criminal investigation was not finished. Nobody shouted him down. That mattered. The board was not there to pretend an accusation was a conviction, simply because everyone was angry. Then Denise moved to the consent records. She summarized what the board now knew rather than repeating the entire file. The original one-year release existed, the 2026 renewal, and Chloe's required assent did not. Yet the campaign had been presented internally, as approved, and brochures had already been printed. Elise did not deny that the new signed form was missing. She argued that our family had handled campaign permissions informally for years. I had allowed continued use before. Chloe had attended events. Old photographs had remained in circulation. There had been no reason, Elise said through her attorney, and then in her own measured explanation, to believe the relationship had suddenly changed until the recent conflict. I listened without interrupting. There were pieces of truth inside her defense. That was what made it effective. I had been careless. I had let informal permission become normal. I had helped create the conditions that allowed Elise to assume Chloe would keep saying yes. But the fact that I had failed my daughter before did not create permission forever. Denise did not need to make that argument emotionally. She returned to the records. The campaign required a current written authorization. There wasn't one. The policy required Chloe's assent. There wasn't one. Whatever anyone believed about previous years, the internal records had represented those two things as settled when they were not. Denise then summarized the preserved security chain without pretending any one piece proved intent. The badge system placed Elise in the prep room during the relevant window. The hallway footage showed her leaving with a small purple object. Marcy confirmed Elise had entered alone, and Chloe's labeled pouch had been recovered from the documented staff-only carton and transferred to investigators. Chloe's limited statement was read. No full medical history. No years of seizure records. Only what she had authorized. She had not assented to the campaign. The pouch had been in the tote. It was gone when she looked for it. She experienced the breakthrough event. Elise said she was milking it for attention. I watched Chloe while Denise read the statement. She kept her eyes on the table. For years, adults had told her story with music, photographs, donor numbers, and carefully chosen language. This version took less than 2 minutes. It was the closest any foundation document had ever come to sounding like her. Elise challenged each piece separately. The badge record proved she entered a room she was allowed to enter. True. The camera did not prove the purple object was Chloe's medication. True. The carton could have been packed by someone else. True. The campaign authorization issue could be an administrative failure rather than deliberate deception. Possible. The financial review was incomplete. Also true. For a few minutes, I understood why complicated systems were so easy to defend. If every piece had to carry the entire case alone, nothing would ever be enough. But that was not what the board was being asked to decide. They did not need to determine whether Elise had committed a crime. They needed to decide whether the woman running the organization could still be trusted with its authority while all of these failures surrounded the systems she controlled. Elise changed direction. She began talking about results. The foundation had helped hundreds of families. Medication assistance was real. Transportation support was real. Donors had responded strongly to Chloe's campaigns for years. Elise had commitments already made around the next launch. The organization could not function if every operational decision became vulnerable to a last-minute family disagreement. She talked about the $420,000 grant freeze. She talked about frightened donors. She talked about the risk that families could lose assistance because the board panicked in response to allegations that had not yet been proven. I could see several directors listening carefully. They should have. Those consequences were real. Then Elise looked toward Chloe. Something in her expression softened, but it was the same softness I had seen when she tried to persuade people that control was care. She said Chloe had benefited from being part of the foundation too. She had been celebrated, supported, given a platform. Her story had reached thousands of people. That visibility had helped build programs other families now depended on. Chloe shifted beside me. I felt her hand move toward mine beneath the table. I held it. Elise continued. She was no longer talking like someone defending an accounting entry. She was talking like someone explaining a principle she genuinely believed. A 13-year-old could not be allowed to destabilize programs serving hundreds of families simply because she had become tired of a photograph. Then she said it more plainly. A 13-year-old does not get to decide whether hundreds of families lose a program because she's tired of a photograph. The room went still. Elise had not admitted hiding medication. She had not admitted stealing money. But I no longer needed either confession to understand the belief that had shaped everything else. Chloe's consent was optional when the mission needed something. My permission was administrative when deadlines required momentum. Source documents were friction when growth looked good. Oversight was inconvenient when results were strong. Elise. And you spent so many years believing the foundation's good work justified her decisions that she could no longer hear what she was saying. I answered only once. Helping families never gave you ownership of Chloe. That was all. I did not give a speech. There was nothing left to explain. Across the table, Elliot lowered his eyes. When it was his turn to speak, he did something I did not expect from him. He stopped defending himself. He told the other directors that he had relied too heavily on executive summaries. He had watched budget performance without demanding enough source documentation. Walter had asked him to look deeper, and Elliot had treated that request as unnecessary friction during a period of growth. He said the board could not solve the problem by deciding that Elise alone had failed. If they suspended or removed her, and then continued using the same weak controls, they would only be waiting for the next failure to arrive under a different name. He asked for an expanded independent controls review, including his own role. Then he supported immediate action to remove Elise from operational authority while the audit and investigations continued. My mother was not at the table as a director. She had no vote. But Denise had allowed her to attend the relevant family portion because of her honorary connection to the foundation and because so much of the pressure surrounding the dispute had come through her. Joan had barely spoken. For most of the meeting, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking older each time another document was described. When Elise talked about Walter's legacy, Mom finally lifted her head. A few days earlier, that argument would have moved her immediately. This time, it did not. She looked at me first, then at Chloe. She said she had spent the week after Walter died confusing two things. protecting what he built, and protecting Elise from what had happened inside it. They were not the same. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Mom did not ask Chloe to forgive her. She did not suddenly become brave enough to erase every choice she had made before that moment. But she stopped using my father's name as a shield. For Joan, that was the first honest thing she had done since the investigation began. Denise checked the time. The portion of the meeting involving Chloe and me was over. The directors needed to enter executive session to discuss personnel action, legal exposure, and governance matters we were not entitled to hear. That boundary mattered. I had spent 2 weeks learning that truth did not become stronger when people pretended to know things they had not witnessed. So Chloe and I left. We sat in the reception area. The same side table was there where she had found the campaign brochures days earlier. The stack was gone now. Someone had removed it after my written notice. Chloe leaned back against the chair and closed her eyes. I did not know what was happening behind the conference room door. I did not know who was arguing for Elise. I did not know whether the motion would pass. I knew only the mechanics Denise had explained before we left. 6 voting directors. A valid quorum. Elise did not vote. A majority could act on her authority as an officer. Everything else belonged to the people in that room. We waited. I watched the second hand on the reception clock move around its face more times than I could count. At one point, Chloe asked whether Grandpa would have known what to do. I thought about the unfinished packet in his box. No, I said. I think he was still figuring it out too. For once, that answer seemed enough. Almost an hour later, the conference room door opened. Denise came out first. Elliot followed several steps behind her. Elise did not. Denise sat across from Chloe and me. The board had passed a motion by a clear majority, 5 votes to 1. Elise was removed from executive director and officer authority effective immediately, subject to whatever employment and contract matters council still had to handle properly. Her foundation access credentials would be revoked. Independent interim management would oversee daily operations. A separate motion expanded the audit and imposed interim controls, including a freeze on new youth campaign use until authorization records could be reviewed. The board had not declared Elise criminally guilty. It had not decided what prosecutors would do. It had decided something narrower and, in that moment, just as important. She would no longer control the institution while those questions were answered. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. The woman who had spent years becoming almost inseparable from the foundation had just lost the authority to run it. And I had gained nothing. No title, no board seat, no office, no inheritance of the mission. That felt right. I had never wanted Elise's chair. I wanted Chloe out of it. Later that evening, Denise confirmed that the preserved evidence involving the medication pouch had been added to the appropriate investigative review. Any criminal decision would remain with law enforcement and prosecutors, not the board. There was no arrest waiting outside, no instant justice, just processes continuing because the evidence required them to. Before we left, Denise received another message. I knew from her face that it was not the clean ending everyone wanted. The institutional donor had responded to the board's governance action. The $420,000 bridge grant would not automatically be restored. Removing Elise was not enough. Before releasing the money, the donor wanted an independent chair or equivalent governance leadership, evidence of corrected controls, and an audit milestone showing the board had actually repaired the weaknesses that allowed the problem to grow. Chloe looked at me. The disappointment on her face was almost childlike again, and I realized how much she had hoped the vote would make everything safe at once. So doing the right thing doesn't fix it right away? 5 months later, the wall was still covered. That surprised me more than it should have. So much had changed since the morning Chloe collapsed in my arms that I had assumed the physical evidence of the old foundation would disappear first. Elise's name was gone from the executive director's office. New signatures appeared on donor letters. New approval boxes had been added to forms. People who once waited for Elise to tell them what came next now asked for written authorization before moving anything forward. But the older campaign panel in the foundation lobby had remained while staff worked through the old materials one by one. No child should miss a dose. Chloe's younger face still sat beneath the words. The irony had become almost unbearable. By early spring, the investigation into foundation finances had moved beyond the questions Grandpa first wrote in the margins of invoices. Elise had not been convicted. There had been no trial, no sentencing, no dramatic moment in which a judge announced that every suspicion had been correct. What had happened was slower. The financial investigation continued after her removal. Records gathered through the warrant, bank information obtained through lawful process, Gavin's review, and the vendor documentation were examined together. Eventually, the appropriate charging process resulted in formal criminal charges connected to the alleged diversion of charitable funds. The language mattered to me. Alleged, charges, proceedings, not conviction. I had learned enough over those months to stop wanting every difficult process to end in one clean sentence. The missing medication remained a separate matter. The purple pouch, badge access record, hallway footage, Marcy's statement, and Chloe's limited medical documentation had all been preserved and provided through the proper channels. County authorities continued reviewing that evidence as its own branch of the case. I did not control what charge, if any, would ultimately come from it. That had once frustrated me. Now I understood why it was necessary. My job had been to protect Chloe, preserve what we knew, tell the truth about what happened, and refuse to let the incident be minimized. I was not the prosecutor. I was not the board. And I was not going to become another adult who believed caring deeply about an outcome gave me ownership over every decision required to reach it. Elise had already lost the thing she seemed to value most: control. She was no longer executive director. She did not walk into the building and have people rearrange meetings because she entered the room. She did not approve campaigns, speak for the foundation, or decide which version of a story reached donors. For years, I had thought satisfying consequences would feel louder. They did not. Sometimes accountability looked like a revoked password, a new name on a door, a meeting happening without the person who once believed nothing could happen without her. The foundation survived. Not easily. That mattered too. Several donors walked away after the investigation became impossible to ignore. Some did not want their names near controversy. Others paused support while waiting to see whether the board's promises of reform were real. Non-essential public relations spending was cut first. Outside consulting contracts that could wait were reduced or canceled. Planned promotional work disappeared from the budget. The board used reserves to keep the core medication assistance and transportation programs operating, while the organization rebuilt enough trust to secure longer-term funding. There were delays. I would be lying if I said nobody felt them. A few planned expansions were postponed. Some families waited longer for decisions than they would have the previous year. Staff, who had spent years thinking mainly about growth, suddenly spent months thinking about preservation. That reality bothered Chloe. She had not forgotten the $420,000 grant freeze. Every time she heard that a program had been delayed, I could see the old guilt return to her face. She never said she wanted the campaign back. She never told me we had made a mistake. But she still carried the fear that her refusal had started a chain that made someone else's life harder. I learned not to rush in every time I saw it. For years, protecting Chloe had meant acting quickly. Check the clock. Find the medication. Call the doctor. Catch her before she fell. Those instincts were useful when her body was in danger. They were less useful when she was trying to understand something complicated. Sometimes protecting her meant giving her room to feel uncomfortable without immediately replacing that feeling with my answer. The $420,000 grant eventually began returning. Not all at once. The donor required evidence that the reforms existed beyond a press release. The foundation appointed independent governance leadership. New vendor controls required documentation, approval steps, and conflict checks that did not depend on one executive's explanation. Audit milestones had to be completed. Financial reports were tied more clearly to source records. Only then did the donor release the money in stages. The first tranche went back toward the medication and transportation programs it had originally been intended to support. The second came after another governance milestone. Nothing about it felt miraculous. That was why I trusted it more. The foundation did not survive because one wealthy person rescued it or because the scandal disappeared. It survived because people cut expenses, used reserves carefully, accepted outside scrutiny, changed controls, and proved over time that the organization could function differently. The consent system changed too. The new process looked almost embarrassingly obvious once it existed. Every campaign involving a minor had a visible authorization status. Guardian written approval had to be present. For youth ambassadors 12 and older, assent had to be separately recorded. Expiration dates appeared where staff could actually see them. Withdrawal procedures were written down. Old medical stories were not automatically recycled into new campaigns, simply because the images already existed in an archive. If authorization ended, the system said so. No one could simply replace a missing signature with the idea that everyone probably still agreed. I remember looking at the new dashboard during one review and thinking about the photocopy Grandpa had left in his box. Ask why this became permanent. The answer turned out to be less dramatic than any of us wanted. It became permanent because people stopped checking. Because familiarity began to feel like consent. Because good results made uncomfortable questions easier to postpone. Because too many people, including me, assumed Chloe would speak up loudly if she truly wanted something to stop. She had spoken. We had simply trained ourselves to hear hesitation as permission. The board never offered me Elise's position. I would not have taken it if they had. I did not become a director. I did not become executive director. I did not you kings. You please sen. I did not take control of Grandpa's foundation as some reward for having been right. That was never the point. Independent management remained responsible for operations while the board completed its reforms. My connection to the organization became smaller. That felt healthier. I answered questions about Chloe's old authorizations when needed. I cooperated with the review. Then I went home. For the first time in years, my daughter's medical life did not automatically create a job for me inside the foundation. My mother changed more slowly. Joan had never been a director, so there was no board seat for her to resign from. Her accountability had to take another form. She stopped appearing at fundraising events, as Walter's widow and honorary co-founder for a while. She helped transfer family-held records when council requested them. She stopped telling people that protecting the foundation meant protecting Walter's memory. Most importantly, she stopped asking me to fix things she did not control. She never asked me to drop the criminal case, because there was nothing for me to drop. The prosecution did not belong to me. That lesson seemed harder for Mom than any apology. For most of her life, family problems had been things solved by convincing the right relative to stop pushing. This one had moved beyond us. There were documents now, investigators, board actions, processes that did not change because someone cried at the kitchen table. Joan apologized to Chloe eventually, not with a speech. She came to our house one Sunday carrying a box of things Walter had kept at home. She placed it on the dining room table and told Chloe she had spent too much time worrying that the family would be embarrassed and not enough time worrying about what Chloe was being asked to carry. She did not ask for forgiveness afterward. That was the part I noticed most. She left the apology where it belonged, with Chloe. A few weeks later, the foundation contacted us about something new, not a campaign, a youth advisory group. The board wanted several teenagers who had used or interacted with foundation programs to offer feedback on how the organization communicated with young people. Chloe's name came up because of everything that had happened. My first instinct was to say no. I felt it immediately. Protect her. Keep her away from all of it. Do not let these people use her again. Then I caught myself, turning every decision into my decision because I wanted to protect Chloe was still a way of taking the choice from her. So I asked. I explained what the advisory group was, what it would require, and what safeguards now existed. Then I waited. Chloe barely needed time. Not now. That was her answer. 2 words. No explanation, no apology, no promise to reconsider later. The foundation accepted it. No one called back to explain how much good she could do. No one sent a list of families who might benefit. No one asked me to persuade her. There was simply an acknowledgement that her answer had been received. I did not realize how powerful that would feel until nothing happened afterward. No punishment, no guilt, no negotiation. Her no remained no. That was what the policy had always been supposed to mean. By then, Chloe's life had expanded in directions that had nothing to do with the foundation. She was still obsessed with typography. She had begun taking photographs too, although she claimed she was not copying me. She preferred signs, storefronts, handwritten menus, old packaging, and anything with lettering she thought was terrible enough to save on her phone. Sometimes, strangers still recognized her from the old campaigns. Less often now. When it happened, I watched her decide for herself how much she wanted to say. Sometimes, she smiled and thanked them. Sometimes, she changed the subject. Sometimes she simply said she did not talk about her medical history. The world did not end. Nobody became less helped because Chloe kept something private. 5 months after Grandpa died, the foundation finally called about the old lobby display. The authorization had expired. My written non-renewal remained in the records. The organization had finished working through the campaign materials affected by the new policy. They were taking it down. Chloe and I happened to need to visit the office that week anyway. A few of Grandpa's personal belongings had remained in storage, while the audit and management transition were underway. There was a box of old printing samples, family photographs, and small things nobody else wanted to decide what to do with. We went together. The building felt different the moment I walked in. Not unrecognizable, just quieter. The badge reader outside the prep room was still there. The hallway camera was still mounted above it. For a second, my body remembered the morning before my mind did. Chloe emptying her tote. The chair, the missing pouch, her hand on the table, her weight dropping into my arms. I felt my chest tighten. Then Chloe kept walking. So I did too. 2 workers were taking down the old lobby campaign panel. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no one tearing it apart in anger. One man loosened the fasteners while another steadied the panel from below. The words came down first. No child should miss a dose. Then the photograph. For a few seconds, Chloe watched a younger version of herself disappear from the wall, one section at a time. I stood beside her and said nothing. I had spent too many years narrating what things meant for her. When the last panel came away, the wall underneath was plain and slightly lighter, where the display had protected the paint. Chloe tilted her head. It looks bigger. I knew what she meant. The photograph had filled so much of the space that I had stopped noticing the wall behind it. Maybe we had done the same thing to her. We had filled so much of Chloe with the story of epilepsy that adults had stopped noticing how much room existed around it. We collected Grandpa's things upstairs. Most of them were ordinary. A pair of reading glasses, pens, printing samples, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, photographs from years before the foundation existed. Among them was a picture of Walter and Chloe sitting at our old dining room table when she was 6. No campaign sign, no foundation logo, no hospital bracelet. Grandpa was helping her draw one of the crooked stars she used to put on everything. Chloe picked up the photograph. There was another box nearby, containing several old campaign materials, including one of the early posters with her face on it. I watched her look between them. She took the family photograph. She left the poster. That choice told me more than any speech could have. For months I had wondered what Walter had truly left Chloe. It was not a secret trust. Not a voting seat. Not millions of dollars hidden behind some final document Henry had forgotten to mention. Grandpa had died in the middle of trying to correct something he had helped create. He had not finished. Maybe that was the inheritance that mattered, not the solution. The willingness to recognize that doing good did not excuse doing harm. The responsibility to repair what you could. And the understanding that loving Chloe did not mean choosing her future for her. On the way out, we passed the lobby one more time. Workers had already carried the old panel away. I looked at Chloe, expecting her to look back at the wall. She didn't. She was looking at the photograph of Grandpa in her hand. Outside, the afternoon was cool, but bright. Chloe tucked the picture carefully into her bag, then started telling me about a sign she had seen across the street, with terrible spacing between the letters. I listened. Not because she was brave, not because she had epilepsy, not because her story could raise money, because she was Chloe. Behind us, the wall was blank, and for the first time, nobody needed Chloe to fill it.